Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm back filling in for Joan today. She is off celebrating her birthday, and we wish Joan a very, very happy birthday weekend. So, as many of you know, I'm a political science professor at North Central College out in Naperville, Illinois. I've been on Joan's show multiple times, but I think this is my sixth time filling in for Joan, and I absolutely love being here. Couldn't be more thrilled to be back here with you today. And we've got an exciting show lined up for you. I'm even more excited that joining me today in studio is one of my favorite people in the whole world, and that is Dr. Phil Barker. He's been on the show before. Phil Barker is a professor of political science at Keene State College in Keene, New Hampshire. He specializes in international politics, democracy, Trumpism. Phil has joined me on the show previously, but I'm so excited we get you in the studio. You flew to Chicago to hang out and come on WCPT. Welcome, Phil. This is great to have you in studio.
I am thrilled to be here. Thanks for having me. Billy, when you call and say, come out and do the radio show, like, what more excuse do I need to get on a plane? I'm thrilled. I'm happy to be here.
Absolutely. WCPT and all of our listeners are going to enjoy your presence here today. So, all right, before we dive in, and there is a lot to talk about this week, let me give you a quick preview of our plan for the show today. For the first half hour or so, Phil and I are going to offer some thoughts on the first week of the second Trump presidency. And again, it's been a week. We'll open the phone lines after our first break and keep them open from like 2:15 all the way to 3:30. So it's Friday, and on Friday, Joan loves to have some extra phone time, and so we're all for that. At 3:30, we're going to be joined by Jennifer Dresden. Jennifer is a policy strategist at Protect Democracy, which is a nonprofit organization based in Washington, D.C. that seeks to check what it believes are authoritarian attacks on U.S. democracy. Given this week's developments, we felt that it was a very good time to talk with Jennifer about democracy and authoritarianism. And in fact, she's here to discuss a recent report she co-authored titled The Authoritarian Playbook, How Reporters Can Contextualize and Cover Authoritarian Threats as Distinct from Politics as Usual. Then at 4 p.m., we're going to be joined by Roland Paris, who's a professor of international affairs at the University of Ottawa in Canada, and also a former senior advisor on foreign policy to the outgoing Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. We're going to talk with Roland about how Canada is reacting to Trump's imperialist threats, what to make of Justin Trudeau's departure, and then we're also going to talk with him about international politics and what this new Trump-led world is going to look like. He's one of the more thoughtful people we know about international politics, and that's just going to be a really, really fascinating conversation. All in all, we're going to have a lot of fun. So let's dive in. So, Phil, on Monday, we witnessed Trump's second inauguration. And since that week, we've been witnessing what I think has been best described as shock and awe across the political system. So maybe let's begin with some general reactions. What are you thinking as we've walked through this first week of Trump 2.0?
I mean, I think it's just so
it's overwhelming,
much, right?
Yes,
like, I think
yes.
That, you and I, we talk about this all the time on the podcast, in the classroom, and all of that. And even like knowing what was coming, I felt sort of unprepared for what this week felt like. You and I were talking on Monday night, and I was talking about how 6 hours in, it was already the chaos was sort of overwhelming, right? In that 6 hours, you had all the executive orders, you had the Elon Musk Nazi salute stuff, you had like just chaos, and it was a quick reminder that I mean, this is the way it was 4 years ago, but it feels even more kind of unchecked. You and I have talked about that. There's going to be fewer guardrails this time around. So it felt a little sort of whiplashy, and I think you're right. The shock and awe, there have been a couple of political scientists who have used that phrase this week, and it really did. It felt shocking, and I think that's kind of part of the intentionality of doing so much so quickly. I mean, how have you processed it?
Much the same, right? It was just so much so quickly, and we were even talking about what do we cover today, and there are so many potential topics. It's overwhelming. I think there's some intentionality to that. I was struck going all the way back to Monday to the inauguration, the visuals of watching this play out at the Capitol and thinking 4 years ago, after January 6th, how this day we couldn't envision this happening, right? So, in the days and weeks after January 6th, the idea that Donald Trump would win a presidency again, it was not conceivable. And suddenly here's where we find ourselves. The other thing I've been thinking about, and you and I talked briefly about about this is that whenever we see a presidential transition, we talk about a change in government, right? The individuals who operate the government change. But for the most part, the norms, the rules, what we in political science would call the regime stays the same. So the regime is the regime type, the rules and norms, the ideologies that define administration. And it feels to me like we are witnessing a regime change. It's not just about somebody new in the presidency. It's about executive power, consumed by the one individual. It's about, in some ways, cruelty, right? We think about what Trump has done, the way in which he's talking about immigrants, pulling security details on Fauci and all these other individuals. It feels like we've entered a new era of democracy, and I will say I'm troubled by some of what we're witnessing. It's dramatic.
You should be, yeah.
Yes,
it's troubling, yeah. No, yeah, the punitive nature of so much, and we kind of expected that, but watching it play out feels, it's just, seeing it in reality is hard to wrap your head around. But the idea that we're I think certainly, even if we're not entering a new regime, that is certainly Trump's goal, right? Whether he consciously knows this or not, certainly the people around him in this movement, that's part of the idea of destroying these old norms, changing how we think about, everything from how government functions to who belongs, right? We just finished talking to your classroom about nationalism and who belongs and all of that. And whether he'll be successful is the big question, right? How can our old regime, can our old institutions stand up to this? And you and I talked on the podcast this week, the citizenship question, right? The birthright citizenship, which he struck down in an executive order. A court has already stepped in and said you can't do that. But the real question will be as it moves forward, how well can our institutions hold up? Because looking back, that's the other part that I felt this week. And you talking about there's no. It's hard to, it would have been impossible to imagine that we would be here 4 years ago after January 6th, but our system has failed, right? In lots of different ways, different individuals, different systems, and it held up well in some ways, but the ultimate test of democracy here we certainly didn't pass the test. And so it'll be interesting to see moving forward how resilient some of those institutions are.
And we're going to see those test of those institutions. We're seeing them immediately, right? Because unlike that first Trump administration, where the reality is in 2016, Trump didn't think he was going to win. And he was surprised when he won. And so then when he came into office, he brought a lot of the old establishment Republicans, the Rex Tillersons, those individuals who had some experience, were old school, Bush 1 type Republicans. That's not the case anymore. He's hit the ground with his team, and the sort of ambition at which they are sort of putting these executive orders out. They're trying to restructure how we understand the role of the presidency in the United States. And it's astonishing in terms of the ambition and what they are attempting to do. And I think you're right to say we don't know if they're going to be successful. But I also wonder, maybe they don't even care about that, right? It's about branding, right? You want to be seen as you want to end birthright citizenship. Whether you actually end it or not, I think they would probably prefer to have that be the case. But they like being out there saying we want to get rid of it.
You're 100%. I think that's that shock and awe, that day one, however many executive orders it was. I feel like that's a message, right? It's a message to his supporters that, hey, I'm going to get stuff done. But it's just as much a message to his opponents that, this is there's an inevitability to this, the overwhelmingness. I think we'll talk some today about how do you respond and how do you remain resilient in that. But I think that's certainly a big part of it. And the other part is, it's not just that Trump is surrounded by more people who are on board. The state of the Republican Party it's not just the people close to him. It is his control of the Republican Party is complete, and that's not just the administration. It's members of Congress. It's the American people, where the number of people who have bought into his version of January 6th has shifted in not a great direction over the last 4 years.
Absolutely, 100% right. He's trying to rewrite that narrative. Absolutely. And again, just how quickly they are moving on all of these things is suggestive of where he wants to go, right? I mean, he's not holding back. And you talked about, we talk about the cruelty and the bitterness that's there. The fact that, going after the Justice Department feels like that's going to be a fundamentally different place. Since Nixon, we've had this divide between the law and order side and the political side. And we are seeing those are gone, not just in the Justice Department, but across the board. We're talking about health organizations, this presidency is going to run, this executive branch is going to run through the president. Yep. And these cabinet positions, they'll be there, but everything is basically going to be determined by the great leader, right? I mean, this is, a dramatic shift.
Like cult of personality stuff. Yeah, and it's also, you look back at presidencies, Trump is claiming to have a mandate. That's, there's all sorts of issues with that. But this is a man claiming to have a mandate. But all administrations begin, their first acts are they're prioritizing the stuff and so you can learn a lot by looking at how that first day, how that first week has gone. And the amount that is sort of petty retribution kind of stuff is I think very telling, right? Like he didn't come out of the gate pushing for tax cuts, right? He came out of the gate pushing for punishing his political enemies, targeting immigrants, all that stuff. That's the theme.
And then the other part of this, I know we got to get to a break in just a second, is also sort of the grift and the graft, right? I mean, so like Trump coming out with his own currency, all of these things are in the open, and he's doing them knowing that he is challenging all of these norms. So, we got to take a quick break, but maybe we come back. We can kick around the idea. You mentioned January 6th, sort of think a little bit about the implications of that. We will be right back on WCPT.
Choose Views with Richard Chew.
Fear everything and run, or face everything and rise. And I said it's just two different ways of creating an acronym for the letters of the word fear. One choice is to fear everything and run, or face everything and rise. And I think that right now, we as progressive liberal Democrats have the opportunity, like no other, to face everything and rise.
Richard Chew, weekday mornings at 6 on WCPT 820.
Chicago's Progressive Talk, WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm filling in for Joan today, and I'm joined by Phil Barker, professor of political science, and we have been thinking through this first extraordinary week of the second Trump presidency. But before we get back to all that, we're going to talk a little bit about January 6th. Let's officially open up those phone lines, so you can give us a call at 773-763-9278. We can talk about anything on your mind, and let me tell you, Phil, there's a lot that we can talk about this week. So if you want to talk about anything related to the pardons or the birthright citizenship, I mean, whatever that you are thinking about, I think it's relevant for us to kick around. And also, if you don't normally call into the show, or maybe you're a first-time caller, like, we encourage you to pick up the phone. We'd love to hear from you. And so this is a really good way to kind of think through what we're seeing play out in our democracy. So please give us a call at 773-763-9278. And you can call, or feel free to send us a text as well. So, all right, Phil, before we went to break, you had mentioned January 6th, or we were talking about January 6th, and one of Trump's first acts was to pardon over almost 1,600 people, hundreds of which had been convicted of using violence against police officers. I think this is one of the more controversial of all of the executive orders. I think this sets a tone in terms of the democracy that Trump wants to create and the narrative he wants to set for January 6th. Thoughts as we're thinking through that dramatic event.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's the thing that really, again, there's so many things in that first week, in that first day that could stand out as concerning. So as a political scientist who studies institutions and rule of law and all of that, that's the thing that really troubled me. And it wasn't, it's not even just us alone in that. There are lots of Republicans who were troubled by this. There have been a number of people who received pardons who have come out and said they don't want one. And so, I mean, if you're talking about sort of, again, rule of law, the upholding democratic institutions. So this is like this, combination of his attack on the elections and the kind of culmination of that. It's not just the attack on electoral institutions. It's an attack on the media and their coverage. It's an attack on truth. It's all of this that builds into the big lie. And for him to come in and immediately, again, one of his first steps is to pardon so many of these people. Yeah, that really raises real concerns. I mean, the pardon is always a little problematic, right? But the idea of using a pardon is that it's supposed to uphold justice in some way. And so to see it used this way is really concerning. And I think it doesn't just contribute to this narrative about January 6th in general. It contributes to, you and I could talk a little bit, and we've talked before about violence and the way it plays into violence and upholding those acts as legitimate. legitimate.
Yes.
It's and all of this is also part of Trump's story. I mean, there was an Atlantic article that was arguing that this was essentially Trump pardoning himself as well, right? So there's so many elements to it that kind of keep me awake as a political scientist.
Absolutely right. I mean, maybe we'll get to the violence in just a second, because that's really important. If we think about the likelihood, the propensity for more January 6th type violence, like this only enables that. But I keep thinking about this is a grand effort by Trump to rewrite the history of January 6th, right? So it was a dark moment, and in the hours and days afterwards, across the political spectrum, everybody accepted that. Yeah. And then as time has gone by, Trump has tried to rethink how that, or create a new narrative for what that means, that these are individuals were hostages, that was a day of liberty. And I think what's most troubling for me is how that narrative has rippled out to others, whether, we're talking about members of Congress and elsewhere, on the media, reinforcing that narrative. That's really, really dangerous. And we always have politicians who are trying to spin, but rewriting history, especially an ugly incident like this, feels, again, very Orwellian. Right. I mean, we see this play out in China. What China tries to do is control the narrative and shape how people understand things. And by pardoning these individuals, he is trying to rewrite that history. And I'm sure they are soon going to appear at campaign rallies, 100%. And he will hold them up as heroes. And I just can't emphasize how dangerous that is, both for understanding violence, law and order, all of that. We should be troubled by all of this, deeply troubled. The
celebratory nature in which the people are being released from prison. I've seen a number of experts in political violence talking about how in the aftermath of January 6th and these prosecutions, a lot of the kind of leaders of the movements, the most troubling parts of this January 6th movement, had sort of gone underground, right?
Yeah.
And this is yet another way. There's a lot of talk in political science about how Trump has sort of made it acceptable to say stuff out loud that was, that was in the dark parts of our society. And this is yet another way of doing that. And I mean, there's always this question about, we can look back to, Richard Nixon, and should he have been prosecuted? And there's debates about, did he get away with it, and was the pardon part of the contribution? This is so much. It is that on, magnified in so many ways, because this was a violent attack on institutions, and to just sort of undo all of the justice that had been carried out. It's going to have repercussions.
And that's one of the things that you and I, as political scientists, we read by people who look at war and conflict and violence, and that's one of the things they say is that when you allow these individuals out, you are allowing back out there to make the case, to sort of reinforce this narrative, this counterproductive narrative, and they are going to do that, and it dramatically increases the likelihood of seeing more violence like this. But the fact that so many in the Oath Keepers and the Proud Boys and the leaders of those organizations were locked up sort of diminished them, right? And dramatically. So the work the FBI did over the last few years has diminished the ability of those right-wing terrorist organizations to do what they do. By releasing the leaders, by releasing the foot soldiers, you're now putting them back out there. Again, it would be shocking if we don't see more of that type of violence. And Trump knows this. Mm-hmm. The Republican Party knows this. All of these people are aware of this and willing to take that risk.
Yeah, and it contributes to the story of martyrdom, of like they were suffering unjustly for these patriotic acts, right? It just all contributes to that story. And deeply. I mean, those stories we tell are so important if you look at the development of political violence. And again, we're not talking necessarily about large scale stuff, but I think political violence in America sort of plays out in these small scale kind of, constantly burning under the surface sort of things. And this is going to build on that. Yeah, it was deeply, really troubling for me to watch that January 6th pardon play out.
Well, and you see this, as you mentioned earlier, there's been a number of Republicans who have said, well, we should only pardon the ones who were nonviolent. I mean, J.D. Vance himself had said that, right? Yeah. That, a week beforehand, well, Trump's not going to pardon anybody who carried out violence against police officers. Well, he did. And you see the awkwardness and the uncomfortableness among many Republicans because they also realize this. And to our earlier conversation, as we think about stress on the democracy, this is moments when political operatives can push back against some of the excesses, right? So, you would have loved to seen Republicans come out and say, like, hey, we understand that there's contested understandings of this history, but this wasn't okay, right? That helps reinforce the rule of law. This enables an undermining of that law. And yes, it pushes the democracy in an uncomfortable direction.
Well, even that pushback that occurred, you talk about Vance talking about like only pardoning the ones who were violent. Like that shows the extent to which Trump has been successful in changing this story. Like that is like, again, the only thing that's making the argument that the only thing that was wrong that happened was attacks on police officers and all these people who just violently entered the building to interfere with the exercise of democracy. They're fine. They deserve a pardon. That again shows the extent to which the sort of Trumpian narrative has kind of taken root in American society.
And it creates this surreal moment on Monday, when the inauguration was occurring, where you're thinking about all of that. You're thinking about this space where 4 years ago, it was in the aftermath of the January 6th insurrection. Donald Trump doesn't show up. And so then on Monday, what we do is we try to do the normal thing. All right, all the ex-presidents show up, even though they probably don't support Donald Trump and are troubled by many, many things he does. But they go through those procedures that we normally do and celebrate. But it felt very, very different. Yeah. And I think it was still probably the right thing for, all the ex-presidents to show up because we want to reinforce those norms. But the contrast between the reinforcement and the undermining of those norms, 4 years ago and what we're seeing over the last 5 days is stunning in terms of the pace and the speed of all of this.
Well, this is the challenge. You and I have talked about this for, 8 years now. The challenge is how do you uphold those norms that are valuable and that are important, but that Trump doesn't care about. He wants to see undermined. And so, how do you push back against Trump? He's playing a different game, right? And so the rules are that if you care about the rules and you're trying to uphold the rules and the person you're playing against doesn't, that's asymmetrical, right? That's a real challenge. And so how do you not get dragged into undermining the institutions that you are trying to uphold yourself? Not an easy question to answer.
And we saw a little bit of Joe Biden at the end of his administration, some of the pardons that he put out there, some of the proclamations he put out there. It felt like Joe Biden was a bit defeated by this collapse of norms, right? So he kind of under the table slides a bunch of pardons, which I think he probably realized were problematic, but said, in this new normative environment, I have to protect my family. It felt like he understood the gravity of the shift that was taking place. So it was a dramatic moment. All right, we are up against the break, but we have the phone lines open. When we come back, we'll take some callers. So again, if you are interested, please call 773-763-9278. You want to talk about Trump and the pardons, birthright citizenship, the apparent tech oligarchy, the expansion of executive power, Trump being an old-fashioned imperialist and wanting to take over places. We have lots of topics, the border, immigration. There's a lot to kick around. So please, we'll be right back in a couple minutes, and let's open those phone lines.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. My name is William Muck, and I'm joined by my co-host and best buddy, Phil Barker from Keene State College, and we are talking about the first week of a second Trump presidency. But before we get back to the conversation, let me remind you that tonight from 5 to 7, Elliot Serrano will be here filling in for Patty, driving home with Patty Vesquez, weeknights on WCPT 820. Well, all right, we got a lot of callers coming in, so this is great, and keep those calls coming. So, Lady B, let's start with Jim from Chicago, who wants to talk about Trump's pardon. Hey, Jim, welcome back to WCPT.
Hi, welcome, Phil, to Chicago. It's nice to have him here. If I can borrow a term from Shakespeare, once the subject pays his debt to death, he'll leave behind this militia, Republican militia. I imagine will show up at God knows when or whatever they deem to not be patriotic. And the only antidote to that is a Democratic militia, to meet them head on. That's what I say. And I'm prepared to do it at a drop of a hat. And I'll meet him anywhere, any place, anytime. So that's the way I feel about it. So that's all I have to say. And have a good show, because nobody can stand this, to have an insane militia running around interrupting whatever the ceremony is. Anyway, you guys have a good show. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jim. And no, I think you're echoing a really important point and a very human reaction to all of this, right? So part of why you don't want to use dangerous rhetoric or language that can lead to violence, or why you don't want groups to actually start pursuing violence is that it's cyclical, right? Once that happens, the other side feels like I have to respond, right? That my democracy is being threatened. And again, as we think about the broad things to be worried about with Donald Trump, this language he's used for years and years, Phil, about inciting violence, right? It has an effect of followers are inspired by that language, but then others will feel like they have to respond to it as well.
Yeah, and it's the violence, but it's also, I mean, we talk about it in political science. In a healthy democracy, it's normal to have disagreements and conflict and all of this other stuff. But in a healthy democracy, the institutions contain that, right? You feel like, you and I disagree about something, and that battle is settled at the voting booth. And so we have elections, we settle our disputes that way. This is why the Trump's approach to politics is sort of doubly dangerous. One of which is he's willing to talk about the use of violence and even if not directly, sort of indirectly support it. But at the same time, he is simultaneously undermining the institutions that have up to this point contained all of this political disagreement and conflict. So now you have, not only is violence okay, but you shouldn't trust the voting booth because you can't trust the voting booth. That's the rhetoric. So yeah, that, like you said, that reaction is normal and understandable, but it is also the sort of thing that is deeply concerning to political science, to observers, because that's the pattern. And it is this spiral of one side sort of starts to withdraw from the system and resort to violence. The other does the same thing. And this is how you end up with, widespread violence. And stopping that and stepping back from it is so really hard.
Yeah, because you go beyond that, because it gets to this idea that it's not the opposition, as you were suggesting, right? People win and they lose elections, and you say, hey, I lost this election, but I'll come back around next time and maybe I win. But when you frame the other side as the enemy, as evil, right, as dangerous to the democracy, well, then you can't allow that to happen. And Trump is just very, very effective at using that kind of language where his supporters are motivated to say, we need to do everything we can. That was January 6th, right? Those that were carrying out the attack on the Capitol, I have no doubt they actually believed that their democracy had been stolen. So we understand the impulse, the motivation there, but it's still really, really dangerous. And to Jim's point, it motivates others to say, like, I can't let this happen, and I'm willing to stand on the other side. And like that's when you start drifting into really, really dangerous democratic places.
Well, and this is, again, back to the idea of both eroding institutions, but the ways in which Trump is sort of so effective at this, because he's speaking to his supporters, but his approach to politics also understandably erodes faith in those institutions among his opponents, right? So it's normal for people to feel like, for people on the left, for Democrats to feel like the Supreme Court isn't going to step in and do the right thing anymore, that elections aren't going to be, upheld. And so he puts that idea out there, but it doesn't just, it infects the whole political atmosphere, right? And so all of this starts to kind of unravel. And yeah, that's why it's so dangerous.
Sure. Well, one of the key elements of a democracy is that we decide we're going to resolve our disputes peacefully.
Right.
And then when you have actors to say, well, we can't do that anymore because the threat is so grave, the whole system starts to fall apart, right? I mean, that's why these norms and the language matters, the threats of violence, all of these things. And again, when something like January 6th happens, you have to condemn it for what it is. Otherwise, it's really difficult to come back. And when you pardon these individuals, it, again, further complicates understanding how we as a country respond to ugly moments in our history. That's really what this is, right? We as a country have to find a way to collectively deal with January 6th. And if we can't do that, it's just like all of the other issues, whether we're talking about race or slavery, all of that. If you don't deal with your history, Phil, it's going to come back and bite you.
Well, I think about the other thing is, when I'm teaching, intro comparative politics, we talk about the idea of democracy. Yeah. Central to that is this idea of a legitimate opposition, right? Yeah. It's the idea that, hey, I disagree with you, but you have a right to participate in this system. And that is again, part of the reason why people lose faith in the elections is because Trump has undermined the idea that the opposition is legitimate. Right? They are set on destroying this, and that is a feature or an issue that goes back long before Donald Trump. Right? Like again, I grew up in the South. This was Rush Limbaugh on the radio when I was a kid. That process began decades ago, but he's latching onto it, and it's the idea that it's the idea that you can use violence because, like you said, Democrats are evil, and that's where this pardon comes in. People who attacked institutions, and you're saying that's okay. Like we're not. That is an acceptable way to participate in politics now. Is the message the explicit if not implicit message? I'm sorry, implicit if not explicit message of those pardons?
Because the other side is so dangerous, anything is justified. No, this is again we find this really an extraordinary moment. So, all right, let's move on. We got some other callers, and again, if you are interested in joining the conversation, 773-763-9278. Please give us a ring or send us a text message. Lady B, let's go to Joe from Chicago.
Yes, hi, good afternoon.
Hey, Joe, welcome to WCPT.
So I think the Democrats really have to do some serious soul searching. At this point, Donald Trump and his supporters have very low ideas about the intelligence of the Democrats to have let him walk out of the White House free and not get really prosecuted for his crimes, and to let him run again and be reelected. Meanwhile, there's some huge void that just can't continue with the top advisors of our party. Let the leaders continue as they are without better advisors and actual spokespeople. Just the transition was just outrageous that Biden sat there through the whole inauguration process. And if you allow me, I could give you like an idea of how that could have been handled better if you're interested. And that would have been to have stated that the Republican Party let Donald Trump run and be elected. We're not going to cause a violent disruption, but we expect them to hold him accountable and to impeach him, and that we're not going to go to his inauguration or pretend that this is a normal transition of power. This is a perversion of democracy, and the Republicans, it's their responsibility to not let him become president. They won the Congress, the Senate, and the president. They can put in a person that has the moral and honest integrity to run this country the way it should be, and we expect him to be prosecuted for his crimes as the evidence shows he committed. We expect the Supreme Court, to hold him and other people accountable to the law.
Joe, you make a really important point.
And this is such a lost opportunity. And so at this point on, the Democrats should be saying the Republicans need to impeach him.
And I think so it's interesting. Like, I think the really important point you're making here is, do you respond to the abnormal with the normal, right? So you have a situation where Donald Trump represents a unique challenge, threat, he's not the normal. So do you respond to that by saying, let's reinforce the way that we've always done things by showing up to the inauguration, by doing the things that we always do? Or do you say we are going to acknowledge how unique and how dangerous this moment is? And I understand why Joe Biden and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton, they all came, right? Because they're saying there's something bigger than this particular moment that we're trying to reinforce. But again, I also understand that impulse to say we need to call a spade a spade. It's a tough one.
It's where Donald Trump puts you in a really difficult position, because what you're wanting to do as the Democratic Party is to say, look, we actually do have faith in elections, right? And we're not going to cry foul just because we lost an election. That's an important principle. But yes, this is the difficult. I think your point is correct in that there's a lot of institutions that failed that allowed this to happen, and you and I, Bill, have talked about this, from the court system, the justice system, the Democratic Party, the Republican Party
bears a lot of this. Yes, absolutely.
Ultimately, the Democrats shouldn't have to be saying this. The Republican Party should be pushing back against this with Trump. But this is the challenge of, if you have to. Democrats continue to play by the old playbook, right?
Yeah.
The old rule book. And Donald Trump is not doing that.
He's not going to do that. And you're right. I mean, as we think about moving forward. So, I mean, Joe was forcing us to think about how Democrats have responded, but also how to think, he talked about some soul searching, right? I think this is a real point as well. Not to necessarily think about where the platform of the party shifts, but that's always useful, but also thinking about how do you respond to a Trumpian dynamic, right? Trump is going to be spin. There's going to be the lies, the disinformation. If you're a party, you have to find a way to confront that. Yep. And I think the Democrats have struggled to some degree doing that, right? Because they want to play by the old rules. And this is an entirely new regime, entirely new normative environment. How do you confront somebody like Donald Trump? And it's I think toward the end of the show, we're going to talk about whether you resist or coexist. But I think even at a micro level, you have to think about talking points to confront a false narrative that is going to be repeated over and over and over again.
Yeah, I think, this is political scientists also talk about this with strategy and whatnot. And the thing I come back to is sometimes you have to violate norms in order to uphold those norms. But the key is the purpose, the intentionality, and the communication of that. So maybe you say, we're not going to attend the inauguration of this president. But, as soon as the Republican Party and the top of their party is willing to accept electoral outcomes, not, embrace the sort of electoral lies of Donald Trump, then we will gladly return to the old system, right? As long as once the Republicans come back to the old rules, we will abide by them as well because we value them. But until then, we're not going to continue to bind ourselves while essentially Donald Trump, runs wild over the old institutions.
Yeah, absolutely right. I mean, Democrats really have to think about that because if we have to acknowledge Trump is very good at what he does, right? I mean, whether we're talking about even, we'll probably talk about the birthright citizenship stuff, how he talks about that can be compelling to an audience, even though it is completely, absolutely unconstitutional, or the January 6th stuff, or, immigration, right? He is driving that narrative. And so Democrats have to be, especially and I think Democrats, small and big D, need to think about how you confront a threat to that democracy, and not allow them to always drive the conversation, to always consume the media outlet. It's a real challenge.
Yeah.
I guess we are up against a break. We will be right back. We will get to a bunch of callers as we're coming back. So let's take a quick break, and we'll be right back on WCPT.
Because facts matter. You're listening to WCPT 820.
Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to WCPT. We are taking calls and having some wonderful conversation about the first week of the second Trump presidency. Let me remind everybody that tomorrow on The Big Picture, Edwin Eisendrath's guests are Jason Stanley, professor of philosophy at Yale University and distinguished professor at the Kiev School of Economics, Tiffany Muller, president of End Citizens United, Alex Aronson, co-founder and executive director of Court Accountability, Andrew Freeman, senior climate reporter for Axios. That's The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath, Saturdays from 1 to 4 on WCPT 820. That is a wonderful lineup of people. I'm excited about that show tomorrow. All right, Lady B, let's go to Steve from the Gold Coast, our favorite political scientist caller calling in. Hey, Steve, how are you?
Fine, thank you. And I would tend to agree with you. I think that once we go down that path, we need to get our guns because they've got theirs. We've surrendered the notion of regimes and order. And whatever comes out the other side, assuming that we win, it has.
I think we did.
And I think that that's troublesome. Hello?
Oh, sorry, we lost you there for we lost you for about 10 seconds, Steve. Why don't you go back and kind of start that point again?
Yeah, well, this notion that, time to get our guns because they have theirs, and, that's just a surrender of those norms and regimes that you're referring to. And it's essential that people understand it. I don't want to get too far down this rabbit hole of nomenclature that tends to be preoccupied with our field, but it's essential that people understand these things. And I contend that, look, Donald Trump, given the Democratic Party needs to do some soul searching, and the Harris and Biden campaign could have done a better job at messaging. I can go through a whole litany of things that could have been done better. But honestly, Donald Trump doesn't win in a different media environment.
Yes.
We live in a world in which people are simply not getting their information from credible sources. So the Harris campaign could have done a great job at trying to get the message across with regard to their achievements in terms of our economy. it turns out on Election Day, about half of Americans thought we were in a recession.
Yeah.
I mean, you talk about living in a parallel universe, but that's because these people are getting their information from these ridiculous outlets, sources. I mean, individuals who have no credentials, who have nobody to fact check what they're saying, and yet people rely on them in a way that the rest of us might rely on the New York Times. But the difference is that the New York Times is a credible news outlet, and they actually admit when they're wrong. And they have fact checkers, and they have editors, and they have people who, again, protect the institution. So I don't know what we do, because this idea of epistemic responsibility is central to all of this. You cannot go back until we start to address the fact that Americans are living in parallel universes. And as soon as you start to have something like a perhaps midterm where Donald Trump faces some backlash against his policies, because we see Democrats taking power perhaps in the House and the Senate, you're instantly going to see, I can lay out the playbook right now. The deep state is still alive and well. The elections were stolen. So, I mean, there's no way we can win or Donald Trump can suffer a loss without that being invoked. And I'm not ready to surrender yet, because, keep in mind, in 2018, Donald Trump was defeated at the polls. In 2020, he was defeated at the polls. In 2022, he suffered a loss. So I'm not convinced that this is the end of the world. But I do agree with you that, look, America is not just important for us as Americans. We are the indispensable country in the world, the indispensable nation. And whether you like it or not, post-World War II, there has been an international regime and order that has been led by the United States. And if we somehow disintegrate or fall into some isolationist ideology, then what? I mean, Great Britain's a wonderful place, but they're not going to take the lead in the international community in the way that we can, or is France, or is Germany, or is Japan.
This is why it's so important for the United States to get its house in order, its democratic house in order. And Steve, your point about the role of the media and information is so powerful. We're at this moment where the media environment, the information environment is so fundamentally different. Phil, one of the things that we saw in the election was that high information voters tended to vote Democratic, tended to vote for Harris. Low information and low engagement voters tended to vote for Donald Trump. It was a clear strategy of his to say, let me use social media to reach out and mobilize those individuals. And because they're low information and low engagement, I can put a narrative out there that they're going to respond to. It makes it really difficult for conventional politicians to overcome sort of a populist authoritarian.
Yeah, no, I think this is, it is the, sort of tragic intersection of a whole bunch of different things. It is, human nature we know, like psychological research shows that, we have motivated reasoning. We want to find the stories, it's easier to buy into, believe the things that back up our worldview. But you take that and you add the sort of conservative media environment that has, again, going back to the 1980s, but has certainly, flourished in the last 25 years. And then you add, modern social media algorithms and whatnot. And it's exactly right. You don't ever have to be challenged. And we know that people are much more motivated, much more likely to respond to, react to those sort of simple and sort of angry,
the populist,
those messages. That's, I don't know. It's easy to give this. It feels like politics has become about, policies versus general sentiment. And general sentiment is easy, right? Explaining policies, explaining to people is hard. Yeah. And in a world of sound bites and algorithms, it's an uphill battle, right? It's exactly the case.
Go ahead, Steve.
Yeah. That's a really important point, because we live in a world of McDrive-through public policy. People want, an answer to everything that's wrong in the world in a couple of sentences, if that. As if a slogan, can define the things that are immensely complex and nuanced that define public policy. But I take you back to the debate between J.D. Vance and what he had to say on this issue, because when you openly say as a vice presidential candidate, don't listen to the experts, don't listen to the people who are researchers and journalists and scholars and so on. He openly said this in a debate. to the American people. I mean, that marks the descent, I think, of Western liberal democracy, because the first thing that authoritarians always do when they come to power is they arrest the college professors, they arrest the researchers, they arrest the journalists. I mean, again, this is where we are, and it's frightening. But I don't think it's the end of the world. I still think that we have enough power, and as long as we have a fair election in 2 years for the midterm, I think you're going to see a sea change.
No, there's a couple thoughts on that, Steve. One, when they come after the professors, the good news is I'm slightly faster than Phil, so I think I've got a little bit of a head start. But I think the other point that you're making is democracy is worth fighting for. And we should also, this might be a good reminder to us that you have to engage the democracy, right? If you don't pay attention to the democracy, if you don't have civic engagement, if your voters aren't learning, right? I mean, we should see this as a moment where we need to pull the democracy up, engage in more civic education. And that's really how you move the country as a whole in a better direction. And eventually, you'll see better candidates than Donald Trump. And the Republican Party will return to a more viable alternative, right? It's important that you have two parties that push each other ideologically. We're just not in that moment right now. And it creates a test for the democracy. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate the call. I always feel like we learn a lot from you, and keep fighting the fight. So let's move on. We've got Ron from Chicago who wants to talk about immigration and ICE agents. Hey, Ron, welcome to the Joan Esposito Show.
Yes, hello. Today the ICE agents were denied access to one of our schools, Chicago schools. And is that going to go to the point where Trump declares martial law here? I just wonder if that's one.
Well, I think we are absolutely entering a moment where we're going to see a divide between the federal and the state and local approaches to this. And over the last couple of days, you've seen things come from the Justice Department where the Trump administration says we're going to go after local officials, local politicians, if they are causing problems. And I understand the rhetoric that he's using. At the same time, there are real jurisdictions that are different, right? The federal government has certain powers, the state has certain power, local. And so what we are likely to see in coming months is real battles for those, where the state starts to assert its ability to say, like, no, you don't have jurisdiction here or under these circumstances. And I think that's where we're heading. Phil, what do you think about that as we start to see the federal, state, local, city divides over some of these issues?
Yeah, I mean, it's fascinating to watch this play out, right? Because this is like, state and local rights is like a classic Republican point,
that's a great point,
so,
yes.
To watch it play out in this way, where they're attacking sanctuary cities and all of that is really, a fascinating twist, and it shows the extent to which conservatism today is not. It's a very different type of conservative than what we used to have.
States' rights feels such an antiquated idea,
The other thing, I mean, the other part of this, I think, is going back to what we talked about at the very beginning of this, which is how much I feel like, or I think that this kind of first week, this sort of flurry of policies and executive orders. I mean, you and I were talking this morning before we came into the studio about how, executive orders are in some ways a sign of a weak president, right? Because it's an inability to actually get a lot of this legislation through the legislative process. But I feel like part of that flurry of activity was to create this sense of inevitability, right? And to make it feel, I think the idea is, I think they want you to feel like if Chicago pushes back, this is going to be martial law. And I think the actual ability of Trump to do that is not nothing, right? I mean, this I don't want to downplay the potential threat, but it's more challenging than we tend to imagine. And that's where it's important to kind of keep pushing back on these issues.
Especially at the state and local level, right? Where the state can say, yes, the federal government has jurisdiction in this way, but this is also an issue of states' rights. And again, the immigration one is challenging because Trump is going to frame these as national security issues. And in that balance between federal and local, the courts tend to defer to national security threats. And that's why Trump is being very, very strategic on this front. Talking about this is people invading, right? There's intentionality to all of that.
Well, and the size of, I mean, the stuff that they're talking about, right? Deporting 10 million, 20 million people. Like, these are logistically massive operations, right? And so that's where I think creating the sense of inevitability is an advantage. It's to their advantage. But the reality of actually doing this is incredibly, complex and difficult. And
it is a real real challenge. And I think to go back to a point you made earlier about states' rights, and I also think about a traditional Republican and conservative value with small government.
For sure.
And what we are seeing out of the Trump administration is the exact opposite, right? The Trump administration is saying, we want a big government, or we want the type of big government we want, and we are going to use it to pursue our political policy ends. And again, that is a very transformational shift of the Republican Party and the conservative movement. So we are up against the break, but we will be right back, and we're going to take some more callers right after this on WCPT.
The Thom Hartmann radio program provides all of the intelligence, information, and insight you'll need to win the water cooler wars. Weekdays 11 to 2 right here on WCPT 820, Chicago's Progressive Talk, where facts matter. Hey Google, play WCPT.
Streaming Chicago's Progressive Talk from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are at the phone lines. We've been taking calls and talking about Trump's first week in office. Just want to remind everybody that Monday on Choose Views, Richard Chu will be here taking your calls and talking with Nathan Schrader, who's a professor of political science at New England College, Creek Stewart, who's a survival expert and author of Disaster Survival 101, and author and investigative journalist Greg Palast, who you might have heard talking to Thom Hartmann just a few hours ago. That's Choose Views, weekdays from 6 to 8 a.m. Central on WCPT 820. All right, let's go back to the phone lines. We've got Marty from Chicago. Marty, you've been on a long time. Welcome to WCPT. Nice to chat with you.
Boy, nice to chat with you guys, too. Happy Friday, professors.
Yes.
So I think a story that kind of got swept under the radar is the release of Ross Ulbricht, the mastermind behind the Silk Road criminal network that, basically gave rise to a useful purpose for Bitcoin. And I think it's very, very strange and ironic that both Donald Trump and Melania have their own crypto coins right now, and that the second phone call Trump made was to the I think it was to the president of El Salvador, right? And they have been the first to adopt a national cryptocurrency. I mean, do you think they're going to raise our minimum wage to 0.006 Trump coin? I mean, is that what we're all going to start paying each other with? It is complete nonsense. And I started keeping a Substack, and this week, my post today was about crypto chaos, and linking all this stuff together. It is really strange. It is it's like, if Biden had Biden bucks that you had to buy that were made, when I think of Biden bucks, I think of the checks that came into my bank account during the pandemic. With those two, that's my idea of Biden bucks, right? Not something I have to pay money for, and in return I get a digital token that says fight, fight, fight. And these are the same people complaining about the price of eggs. And it is just mind-boggling, how much money, how blatant bribery I'm mind-boggled. It's just too many contradictions. It's like
this is such a great point, Marty. Right? And there's always been corruption in politics, but you're right to point out what we are seeing and how Trump is doing this in the open. Right? The corruption, the graft, the currencies. I mean, all of these things. It's so strange and so abnormal. Whether we're talking about Democratic or Republican administrations, you never saw this. Trump is
There's ethical problems with this?
Right. And again, now as we think about the Supreme Court ruling that grants him broad immunity, all of these things are outside of, emoluments, concerns. He can make arguments for all of that. So he is intentionally doing this in the open. And it should rattle us. And again, you're right, the pardon of Ulbricht, which is, deeply, deeply problematic from a law and order perspective. But also, he largely did that for his libertarian supporters, right? The idea that these, he had told when he was campaigning the libertarian group that he was speaking to, where he was getting booed until he mentioned this potential pardon. So it's a quid pro quo kind of situation that, again, we're not so naive to think that there has never been corruption in politics. Of course, there always has, but the scale and scope is something new, Phil.
It's like it's the shame, right? Like in the past, the corruption had been there, but people were, again, it felt the need to cover it up, and it's just out in the open. Yeah, I mean, the sort of the problem, the irony of a law and order presidency, right? Pardoning all the January 6 people, pardoning the sort of the dark web. I mean, it is, it's just there's so much kind of hypocrisy to all of it. But I think in some ways, I think this was in many ways the big issue that Democrats really should have hit on more in the first Trump administration is all the emolument stuff, like the risk of essentially bribery directly or indirectly, and it's just the corruption that has brought into it. And I think because again those sort of norms were eroded the first time around, it's just so blatant now. Again, the idea of a sitting president issuing their own cryptocurrency it's just bonkers. It
is bonkers. And Melania Trump getting, what was it, $40 million from Bezos? It is. All of it is really. We couldn't have imagined this, decades ago, and now we're there. Marty, do you have a solution to all this? Because it's a bit overwhelming.
Yeah, I mean, I totally think you guys are completely correct. I mean, I chose to write, because that's what I can do. So I started a Substack where I point all of this out. And so I'm just like, if I will correct anything that's actually incorrect. I think that's what's going to take all of us, right, is for us all to be aware of this, for us to say, no, we're not going to get paid in cryptocurrency. And anybody who spends money on this kind of stuff is a complete fool. I mean, and I can't understand how. And then also, why is Melania's trading at so much lower? Why is it cheaper?
Right. Yeah, you think about that.
What does that say about? It's so absurd.
It really is, Marty. It's just we're in this new world, and again, the other thing is that this is just the beginning. We're only days in. We're not even a full week in, and it is not going to get better. Right? These are laying the seeds for additional. I would say probably much more egregious corruption to come.
The other head scratcher, bang my head against the wall stuff is it's the pairing of the populism, right, with the sheer corruption, with the surrounding himself with billionaires. That you're how did this sort of a man who clearly is there just to enrich himself, how has he become the spokesman of the everyman? It is.
That's a great point. Yeah. So Marty, really appreciate your call. We got to get to some other callers, but you made us chuckle today, and that's a good thing to do. Let's move on to Christian from Chicago, and I love you. You want to talk about all the topics. Welcome to WCPT.
Oh, hi. How are you?
We're doing well. Welcome to the Joan Esposito Show. What's on your mind?
Well, a couple of things. You guys covered so much, and it's trying to keep up with all the callers and to comment on anything they're saying. But one of the things that I wanted to comment on was that I really don't think that any of the presidents should have showed up at the inauguration. I think that the idea of norms kind of went out the window with Trump's behavior in general, and I think that would have sent a much bigger message than showing up and pretending like everything was normal. I think that Bush has done a tremendous disservice to the Republican Party by not speaking out against Donald Trump and his behavior in terms of taking over the Republican Party. And that Mitch McConnell did a disservice to the country by not holding him accountable in the last administration, by making it so that he could never run for president again, by basically going ahead and convicting him in the Senate.
This is really a fascinating point. And especially, you mentioned George W. Bush, and think about an individual who's kind of remade his image, right? So if we go back to when he was in power in the years after George W. Bush, the Iraq War, there were many people who said he will go down as the worst president in history. And then Donald Trump comes along and sort of we forget about George W. Bush. And then we see I think George W. Bush probably is a very nice man. We see him interacting with the Obamas, Michelle Obama, and they're always passing candy to each other It's sort of cute. But there is a responsibility that he has as a leader of the Republican Party to take a stand in the way, Dick Cheney has a lot of faults, Phil, but he has come out and been forceful critic. And I think George W. Bush has said, I just want to stay away from all of that. And Phil, do you think that's dereliction of duty? What do you think about George W.?
No, I mean, the thing I think that's your point is wonderful, because I think it's, this goes back. I think of Levitsky and Ziblatt. So Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt at Harvard have written a lot about this, and they talk a lot about the role of parties and the role that parties play and party leaders play in speaking up. And this is the notion they talk about of loyal Democrats, like small d Democrats, where your allegiance is to democracy over your party, and how important that is. And in countries that have successfully weathered these sorts of kind of populist, more authoritarian, attacks on democracy, they've survived because the parties have done the right thing. And so, you're exactly right. I mean, there will be, I think history won't, certainly the McConnells, I think, will be judged even more harshly than the Bushes. But yes, I think, this is the notion that, powerful people have a lot of responsibility. And if you want to be president, if you were president, you have a responsibility to speak up on these things. So I think, yes, Bush certainly holds a lot of responsibility here. The other part, your argument that they shouldn't have gone to I think it's a totally valid point and argument. Bill, you and I have a lot of background in international relations as well. And I think of, there's a lot of sort of writing about sort of like rational choice stuff, but also like strategies and how you should deal with international crises. And one that I think about a lot is this notion of tit for tat, which is, the strategy of essentially when you're working or cooperating with someone else, you sort of do what they do. So if the Republicans are going to abandon norms and institutions, then Democrats sort of do the same, but you do it with the message that we are happy to go back to these rules. That's why I mentioned a couple of, before the break a while back. And so that's the key, right? You don't show up, but you make it clear that we're not showing up because we value these institutions. So we're doing it to protect the institutions, not to abandon them or destroy them.
Christian, two wonderful points there. What other thoughts you had?
So the other thing that I want to point out, too, was one of your callers was talking about messaging and communication, right? Yeah. I think that part of the problem is that our mainstream media has completely failed the Americans in this country, because they have allowed Donald Trump to run a shadow presidency for the entire 4 years of the Biden administration. Biden was not a good communicator. However, Donald Trump sucked all the oxygen out of the room every single day. And the mainstream media just constantly was there to cover anything that came out of his mouth. And he did nothing but attend rallies. He's poisoned half of this country with his lies. I've never seen anything like it, the vitriol that people will have for one another just based on either being MAGA or not being MAGA. He has turned families against one another, friends against one another. People can't even civilly speak politics. And it's become a very poisonous type of society where you cannot even have conversations. And there is a gentleman who I can't think of his name right now, but he has written a book about the cult behavior of Donald Trump. And he's a psychologist, and he said it was a very difficult decision to decide to write the book about him, because he had to do a lot of research, and he was speaking about it from not only a professional position, but also from a personal one, because he had also been a part of a cult.
Sure. Yeah, no,
and he said that Donald Trump is a cult leader, and he has cultivated the way that cult leaders control their people. And I think that's a very scary thing.
Absolutely right. And you think about the charismatic, the cult-like dynamics of this. So at 3:30, we're going to have Jennifer Dresden, and you're going to really like this, because she talks about this, and she writes this. We'll talk about this report, The Authoritarian Playbook, focusing on what the media can do to better cover authoritarian threats. So that's, I think, stay tuned, because that's going to be a really good conversation. Now, we are up against the break. Thank you so much for the call. We come back, we'll take a few more callers on WCPT.
The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath, Saturdays at 1 p.m.
I'm thankful, really, that anyone could feel they could call into this show and share their real despair and anger. I am. I can only hope that we can get past the disappointment and the anger with each other. to once again focus on these longer term and very large fights.
The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath, Saturdays at 1 p.m.
WCPT 820, Chicago's progressive talk, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to WCPT and the Joan Esposito Show. We are taking callers and talking about everything related to Donald Trump in his first week in office. Just want to remind everybody that Monday, during this time slot, Joan Esposito will be back, and her guests include immigration attorney Kate Lincoln Goldfinch and Cameron Stevenson, founding editor and chief political correspondent at the Arizona-based newsroom Copper Courier, live, local, and progressive, weekdays from 2 to 5 p.m. on WCPT 820. All right, let's get back to the phone lines. So we've got Paul from Seattle who wants to talk about the 14th Amendment, a really, really big deal. Hey, Paul, welcome to the Joan Esposito Show.
Yeah, thanks. I wanted to point out something kind of comical about Trump's executive order and his style in general, is that I think a lot of people don't realize that his executive order, which, by the way, a federal judge here in Seattle blocked it yesterday.
Wonderful, yes,
on abolishing birthright citizenship, which really isn't a thing. It's how we refer to the first sentence in Section 1 of the 14th Amendment, but it doesn't have an intrinsic definition. But what people tend to think is that, oh, good, this only applies to undocumented people in the country who are going to try to have anchor babies. It's what applies. It applies to all of us. Mm-hmm. It's what makes us all citizens.
Yeah.
In other words, if I ask you, William, what are you a citizen? And you say yes, and I would say, what makes you a citizen? You would say, I was born here, right?
Right, yes.
That's it. And so if you abolish the birthright citizenship clause, you abolish the standard definition, the only one that's in the Constitution about what makes a citizen.
Yes. And you know, there are times where there are legal questions that work their way through the court system where you say, hey, the Constitution, there's some ambiguity to that, right? Yeah. You can interpret it in different ways. But the 14th Amendment, when you read it, especially as it relates to birthright citizenship, is pretty darn clear. And I'm glad, Paul, you brought up the ruling out of, Seattle, where that federal judge, who was a Reagan appointee, really read the riot act to the Trump legal team. And I have a quote here. He says, I've been on the bench for over 4 decades. I can't remember another case where the question presented is as clear as this one. This is a blatantly unconstitutional order, right? And then he goes on to attack the attorney, say, frankly, I have difficulty understanding how a member of the bar could state unequivocally that this is a constitutional order. It just boggles my mind, right? I mean, and I guess what I found so reassuring about this was that a judge was saying, like, no, we are going to push back on this interpretation. And again, Paul, it is comical. Phil, what do you make of all of this?
Yeah, I mean, it'll be interesting. It'll be a good test as it works its way up through the courts. This is you and I talked on the podcast about it.
Yes.
The thing that I think about is you're right. This notion of we all of our citizenship is set up this way based on birth. And I think about the sort of core principles when you look at around the world, how do countries dictate or set up their citizenship? And the alternative is what we talk about as blood. It's the law of the soil, right? Or it's law of blood, right? And so I think part of it is a lot of what Trump does, I feel like, is less about the specifics and more about the message or again, this larger sentiment. And we were talking with your class today about this idea of white Christian nationalism, and I think that's kind of the message. It's a message to his supporters as much as anything, right? And it's this notion about who belongs, because if it's not whoever is born here, that raises all sorts of other questions about, well, who is it? This is not a situation where German heritage means something. It's a different makeup here in the United States, and that's the part that's sort of left out there unspoken, but I think implied about who does get citizenship based on this.
Well, Paul, the other thing that strikes me, and I'm glad you really brought this up, is Trump often says we're the only country that does this. This idea of birthright citizenship.
It's not true at all.
It's not true at all, right? I mean, you look at the map. map. I'm looking at a map right here. All the way across, the Americas, this is done. It is a very, very common practice. Now, it is true that other parts of the world do it more based on family, but absolutely. I don't know, Paul, I cut you off there. Other thoughts you have about this?
Well, yeah, and I think people presume that, it only applies to documents. I'm a citizen because my parents were citizens or because I have a birth certificate. And those all may be evidence to the fact that you were born here, but they are not the fact themselves, and they're not mentioned in the Constitution. And you talked about other countries. For instance, Canada, the birthright citizen, it states that natural-born citizen is born within the domain of Her Majesty's jurisdiction. So Canada and England is like that too. So, yeah, for them to say we're the only ones is absolutely ridiculous. And so then as the court has to interpret what does this particular sentence that we call birthright citizen to me, they have to look at common law. Of course, I don't know, Brett Kavanaugh seems to be against common law. He just wants to,
right.
But that's what it says. That's where it comes from. And if you wipe out that sentence, you look at it's kind of funny because if you look at the articles before the amendment, there is no. If they talk about citizenship, for instance, in Article 1 about who you have to be a citizen to serve, but it never talks about in the Constitution what makes you a citizen.
Yeah. Right.
Before the 14th Amendment, it does not state that. It's very ambiguous, and so I don't know what people think makes them a citizen, and they presume because they have all these. They think there are all these defaults or things that will revert to making them a citizen, and it only applies to these undocumented people. But it's not true. It is the standard what makes us all citizens, and this is what he takes a swipe at things, hoping that that's good enough for his base. At least he took a swipe at it,
right.
And therefore it stands. But that's not the way you read law. And I know he's trying to convince the Supreme Court to read law by taking a swipe at things, and he's been somewhat successful with some of the justices, but.
Yeah,
I don't know.
I think that will be the ultimate test.
Yeah.
Is again, prior to Donald Trump, this would have been, I think, an open. Nobody would have even attempted this, right?
No.
And it would have been such an obvious. This is unconstitutional. We don't even need to have the debate. But that's also true for like presidential, absolute presidential immunity. So the court has ruled in ways that are questioned. We'll see. I would like to think that this is an open shut, top to bottom kind of case,
and one that's 9-0, right? This can't be even a 8-1 or something like that. Alito doesn't get to cause any trouble here. All right, well, we got one more caller, Ron from Michigan, who wants to talk about Elon Musk. Hey, Ron, welcome to WCPT. What's on your mind?
Hello, Phil and Bill. But, here's the thing. We are living in a world of the Twilight Zone episode in which but it's come to fruition. It's the episode where the Civil War is about to end, and the Confederates come upon an old devil, and he has the book of spells. And if the Confederates will swear by the book, of course they have to swear allegiance to the devil, then they will win the Civil War. And that's what happened with the Republicans. And we are in the final stage with Trump. And like you said, with all these economic deals that are unparalleled, unbelievable, that the Trumps are doing. What's even more is Musk and his Nazi stuff. He is a full-fledged Nazi from his upbringing in apartheid South Africa. And to this day, he is calling the German government to turn Nazi. He is giving open Nazi salutes. He runs his factories like he wants to run them like they ran the Nazi slave labor where you were worked to death. And the only privilege you had was work fast and die quick. But those prisoners, they maybe were able to scratch a bullet, scratch an artillery shell, maybe twist a V-1 rocket so it went off course and veered off an American tank. And I contend that's what happened in his factory. The union, anti-union, is hiring of labor from overseas. Get them cheap. Get rid of them if they buck them. But that's the only thing that's going to save us is possibly gremlins from within this whole empire that they are creating, Nazis. And Trump has frozen every legal aspect, every norm. It's the same thing as if the Union soldiers are frozen in their tracks. Nobody can touch him. He just keeps ascending, and his followers keep getting richer.
Ron, I hate to cut you off, Ron, because I totally appreciate your point. We're up against the break. We got to get to it, but you were absolutely right to say that Elon represents something fundamentally different. He is violating norms, and again, this whole thing of the Nazi salute and all of that, deeply, deeply problematic. So, we got to go to a break here. Thanks for the call, Ron. When we come back, we're going to be doing an interview with Jennifer Dresden from Protect Democracy, and we're going to talk about the authoritarian playbook and how we need to confront, or how the media should confront authoritarianism. So we'll be right back in just a second.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck. Because that's how we roll.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are so delighted for our next guest, Dr. Jennifer Dresden. She is a policy strategist at Protect Democracy, where she helps teams leverage leading social science research to inform their work in defense of democracy. She was previously a member of the faculty and the associate director of the Democracy and Government program at Georgetown University. She's a leading voice on democracy and authoritarian politics, and what a wonderful time to be having this conversation. And she is here today to discuss a report she co-authored for Protect Democracy titled The Authoritarian Playbook, How Reporters Can Contextualize and Cover Authoritarian Threats as Distinct from Politics as Usual. Welcome, Jennifer, and thank you so much for joining us on WCPT.
Thanks so much for having me.
So, all right, maybe we start by diving in and start with the big picture look at the authoritarian playbook. Can you tell us a little bit about the report and why you thought it was so important to focus in specifically on what newsrooms and the media more broadly can do to cover the sort of anti-democratic elements within the United States?
Sure. So there's been a lot of talk over the last few years about American democracy being in danger. And in general, I think that people recognize that, right? Pretty much any poll that's asked Americans whether they're worried about the health of our democracy over the last few years, the vast majority, 60, 70, sometimes even say like 80%, say that they are concerned, right? They're concerned about the direction our democracy is going. They're concerned about the health of our democracy. But the U.S. isn't alone in having challenges in that area. There's been a global wave of democratic backsliding over the last 15 to 20 years. And when we take a broader view, we can see that democracies aren't collapsing all at once, and instead they're kind of eroding bit by bit over time. So they all have that in common. But also there's a lot of commonality in the types of things that are contributing to that erosion. We call these the 7 tactics of the authoritarian playbook, and you really see them play out again and again around the world. But to the second part of your question, we specifically wrote the report to be a resource for media because covering this for journalists is actually really, really hard. A lot of the things that would fall under those tactics, they might seem technical or isolated or wonky or even just kind of the same old politics. But if the media can't put these things in context, the public won't recognize what's going on until it's too late. But at the same time, when you're on a deadline and you have 800 words or 2 minutes to cover some of these stories, you don't exactly have time to sit down and read like a bookshelf worth of background. So we tried to put all of this into a format and a resource that journalists could actually use.
That's so interesting because, in academics, we've got lots of time to think about and study democracy. But if you're working as a journalist, you don't have that same sort of time. It has to be immediate. And it's really useful to be able to think about these things as, okay, here's what I need to be watching for and here's what I need to be responding to.
Yeah, exactly. It's really not easy. It is a tough job. And so this report was intended to be a resource to help with that, really.
So, part of the reason why it feels like this is so challenging is, you talk you mentioned this in your first response there. You say in the report that authoritarian takeovers rarely happen overnight, and that the authoritarian playbook is a process that happens piecemeal and is hard to distinguish from normal political jockeying. And you talk about this idea of salami tactics, and I feel like this is part of the challenge is that the way that people are chipping away at democracy plays out in this kind of unique way. Can you talk a little bit about what you mean by salami tactics and maybe, give us some examples of that?
Sure. So I mentioned before that we see 7 tactics that are used commonly around the world. That includes things that would-be authoritarians do, like politicizing independent institutions or aggrandizing executive power, really attacking checks and balances, spreading disinformation, corrupting elections, quashing dissent, targeting vulnerable communities and stoking violence, in service of this broader, this broader pattern. And what we mean by sort of the salami tactics is that any one of these things on its own might not be enough to do real damage to our democracy. But they build on one another. And over time, what we see happen is that the health of the system gets weaker and weaker, so that something that, our democracy might be resilient to, right? An attempt to sort of expand executive power in one area could be checked by some of these other things. But over time, the system weakens in ways that sort of feedback loop doesn't kick in. So, for example, if you're an executive looking to take power and bit by bit you can squeeze out the space for opposition in the press or in civil society, you might then have kind of the wiggle room and the ability to politicize the judiciary, which should be independent, and do that without noise or fuss, and then it's no longer independent. And then you can ensure favorable rulings, right? If anyone tries to challenge your then subsequent efforts to sideline the legislature and claim more executive power, right? So these things kind of build on each other over time. And it's not any one specific thing that happens or any one specific move that we could point to say, yes, that's the moment. That's when democracy collapsed. But this series of actions kind of accumulates over time, and the protections and rights and checks and balances that a democracy relies on all kind of wither away over time.
If only there were, an example someplace in the world where this is playing out right now. That would be.
Well, it's sort of sneaky, right? I mean, it was a lot easier when just with men and with guns showed up and ended democracy. It's very different, that process today. Now, in the report, you talk about that threats to democracy, the press needs to distinguish between normal political jockeying and genuine authoritarian moves. Can you tell us, how do you understand the difference between them? You're sort of hinting at that, but how do you, if you're in the press, how do you start realizing what's one versus the other?
Yeah, I mean, look, democracy is messy, right? There is no way to get millions of people with all kinds of different experiences and ideas to live together and solve problems together. It's not going to look like a prim and proper Tea Party. American democracy in particular is boisterous, right? We expect competition. We expect people who want to lead the country to compete hard for that office. And our system certainly has always been imperfect, and there are always politicians who will try to push the boundaries. So we need ways to tell the difference between the rough and tumble, flawed system that we've had, and when that's just kind of doing what it does, and things that are actually pushing us closer towards a system that we couldn't even plausibly call democratic anymore. So there's a set of questions that we can ask ourselves, and that in the report we encourage journalists to ask themselves when they're writing their stories. And the first is whether something we're looking at is part of the playbook at all, right? We identify these 7 tactics precisely for that reason. And that's, an important threshold question. But even once we agree that something seems like it's in the playbook, we can ask ourselves 3 additional questions to see whether it's something new, right? Does this line up with modern precedent or not? Now, not all precedents are good precedent. Like we've got to be very clear about that.
Yes.
Definitely not all good precedent. But it's a good first test to say, is this kind of politics as usual? Have we seen this happening for a long time? Or is this new? Is it different? Is it pushing the boundaries further? Second, how intensely or extensively is it happening? Is this just one loose cannon who's trying to push the boundaries? Or is this happening again and again and again? Or is it happening in a really intense way? Then we know sort of systemically we might have a problem. And then third, and this is really important, how are others in the system responding, right? Are political allies stepping up to sort of reinforce the guardrails and say, actually, you can't do that? Or are they enabling or permitting this type of behavior, or allowing this type of action to go forward, maybe even enabling it? Because if they're enabling it, that's when we see that the system really isn't self-correcting. And that's when we would say, okay, the quality of democracy is actually moving at this point.
So let me ask a follow-up on that real quick then, because I was reading your report on Monday as we went through Inauguration Day. And, one of the things you mentioned in here is that in relation to this, particularly with executive power, right, this sort of decades-long shift towards executive power, and how much of this is normal versus how much is this something different. And I was reading that as I watched Donald Trump sign 100 executive orders on all of these different things. So, using that as sort of an example, can you talk about, like, how should the media talk about something like Monday? How do you make distinguish that from, or is it different than sort of other presidents signing executive orders, for instance?
Yeah, I think this is where having that background and that context is really helpful. And it's important to put this in context, right? So presidents signing executive orders, we know that has increased over time. We've seen more and more of those. But the types of executive orders we see, for example, where there are differences there, the volume of them, where there are differences there, to be able to put that in context for people so that people understand the background, and people who are maybe inclined to sort of dismiss this as, this is just normal politics. This is, what people do, can kind of see where the difference lies, right?
That's interesting. Okay, so while you're really focusing on the media, as political scientists, we sort of read this with a broader lens, and the findings lend themselves to anybody who cares about democracy. Even the name itself, I love the name itself, the authoritarian playbook, nothing new. The tactics that we see in the United States, we tend to think there's something unique about what's happening here. But you guys are arguing that this is part of a broader pattern, that Donald Trump represents something that's happening across the globe. Can you talk a little bit about how you see this as part of a broader pattern that we need to be thinking about, not just in the United States, but globally? We're seeing candidates who are pushing the boundaries of democracy.
Yeah. As you say, in the United States, we love to think about our politics as being exceptional, and in some ways they are. But we have seen this backsliding going on around the globe for almost 20 years, really. And that ranges from Hungary to Turkey to India, and the circumstances are certainly unique in each country. The particular local politics are distinct. But one of the reasons why I think it's so important to highlight these commonalities is because we can really pay attention to them. We can understand and perhaps even in some cases anticipate what might come down the road. And I think that that's really helpful to be able to do for a couple of reasons. One, I don't want to give the impression that this process requires some like grand chess master level strategy, right? The accumulation of these things sometimes does not necessarily have to be based in any strategy or intention, right? Some of these sort of salami slices can be bumbling. But the effect still accumulates over time. So knowing that and being able to look around the world and see how things have played out, I think is very important. The other thing that I think is important to keep in mind is that, there is dissatisfaction or discontent with democracy in lots of places, worry about democracy in lots of places. But I think looking at this global pattern can also lead us to remember that it's really important not to throw the baby out with the bathwater, and that even where there's a need for reform, even where there's like a clear desire for reform, there are ways to go about that will strengthen democracy in the long run. And there are ways that will have the opposite effect.
This is really
fascinating. Bill and I have talked about that, about the tendency that people's frustration with democracy is actually often mostly a frustration with a specific type of democracy or specific issue in democracy. I think that's fantastic.
We need to take a quick break, but we will be right back to talk more about the authoritarian playbook with Jennifer Dresden in just a second.
That's markdrugs.com.
This is WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We are talking with Dr. Jennifer Dresden, who is the co-author of The Authoritarian Playbook, and we're kind of sort of kicking around democracy and authoritarianism. Phil, I think you were up. You wanted to ask another question. Why don't you take off?
Yeah. So before the break, you've kind of touched on this, and I was going to say hinted, but more than hinted. In the report you talk about authoritarians tend to employ the same 7 basic tactics, and you kind of went through some of those. Politicizing independent institutions, spreading disinformation, aggrandizing executive power, quashing dissent, scapegoating communities, vulnerable communities, corrupting elections, stoking violence. You also talked about how it's not always necessarily strategic. It's often sort of bumbling. And all of this makes me think of Donald Trump, right? I mean, this is like you're going through this list of sort of Trumpian tactics or approaches to politics. And I don't know, I'm wondering if you can talk a little bit about how much of a risk do you see currently in the American system as we enter a second Trump administration in terms of, the warning signs you point to in this report?
Look, I think the risks are very real. And I say that because this is a process in the United States that has been going on for a while now. If you look at the data and if you look at sort of the big data sets that rate the quality of democracy of countries around the world, they have slightly different points for when they say that democratic backsliding in the United States began. But some of them rated as early as like 2011, right? That the quality of our democracy has been backsliding over time. And so the risk in this moment is occurring sort of in that context. And, I think we can look at promises that were made over the last 2 years during the campaign period and prior. We can look at the election denialism that led to January 6th. We can look at some of the actions that have been taken even just this week. And it doesn't take a lot to see how some of this does line up with, the playbook, right? Where we see real risks of politicizing institutions, where we see scapegoating of vulnerable communities. And so I do think that the risk is real. And also, though, we should be clear that this isn't singularly only about one person, right? Norms are kind of like Humpty Dumpty, right? Once they're broken, they're really tough to put back together again. And so that's another piece that I think we have to keep in mind as we approach this period and really think about how important it is to safeguard the core elements of our democracy.
I really like that. Norms as Humpty Dumpty, right? It's really important to think about that. And as you were talking about that, and as we was thinking through the report as well, it occurred to me that a lot of the other leaders in these countries that are also experiencing some democratic backsliding, they share a sense of affection for each other. I mean, you look at Viktor Orban in Hungary or Putin in Russia, Duterte in the Philippines going back a while, and Donald Trump, Bolsonaro in Brazil, they all seem to like each other and appreciate how they play politics. And as I was listening to it, it makes me think that's not a good sign, but it also is eroding these norms, right? Is there an element of authoritarian learning? I mean, are these individuals reflecting on what each other's doing, and do they have their own version of the playbook, do you think, that is sort of shaping how they approach the media and democracy more broadly?
Yeah, I mean, look, it isn't great. But when it comes to foreign policy, look, leaders find ways to work with each other and build relationships for all sorts of reasons. So I'm not going to be Pollyanna-ish over here and suggest that no American president has ever forged a strong relationship with an autocrat. I mean, it wouldn't be accurate. But this question of learning in countries that are experiencing backsliding, we definitely do see that there's a little bit of imitation is the sincerest form of flattery going on. So just one example that we could throw out there, and this is a more sort of international example, but in 2012-ish, Vladimir Putin pioneered using foreign funding laws to just absolutely decimate pro-democracy civil society in Russia. So put in place these sort of seemingly technical bureaucratic laws that went after organizations that received support from international donors. Similar laws have been adopted by other countries again and again as a way of quashing dissent through this seemingly technocratic or bureaucratic enforcement. And so that's just one example of how you can use these moves in ways that others may emulate, right? Over time, it does happen.
That's interesting.
So I'm thinking about maybe the breakdown. I've been stuck in my head, the breakdown of norms, and you were talking about that. The thing that Bill and I we do our podcast, and when we talked this week about Inauguration Day and what stood out to us, the thing that I think for both of us we found the most shocking was the pardoning of everyone related to January 6th. And I think about, to some extent, I mean, this is, again, I think this could tie in with the sort of authoritarian learning, but it certainly ties into norms, political violence, all sorts of other stuff. I'm wondering, what was your reaction as you saw that play out? And does that have implications both for democracy, but also, I know you do some work with political violence as well. I don't know. I'm just kind of curious what your thoughts are as you process that.
Yeah. I mean, I think this is an area where it's a pretty clearly bad for democracy move, right? This was a blanket pardon, including for individuals who are convicted of violent crimes, in a due process, and not meted out in the interests of justice and mercy, which is historically what the pardon power has been intended for. And it also, goes even a step beyond what we've seen. There's been some political science research on the use of the pardon over the last 30 years, and how over the last 30 years, we've seen some sort of creeping on it being used for more sort of personal or political purposes. But this went even a step beyond that, right? And so it is deeply concerning.
So Phil mentioned that you also, one of your other areas of expertise is political violence and democracy. And you have, it's really, our listeners should go check this out. It's called the Violence and Democracy Impact Tracker. Can you tell us what the data is telling you about violence and democracy trends in the United States? And obviously, the January 6th pardons are probably not going to help some of those data points. But what are you seeing when you look at these broad patterns?
Yeah, so the Violence and Democracy Impact Tracker, or VDIT, because that's a mouthful. VDIT is a survey of political violence experts from around the world who we have asked quarterly over the last year and a half or so how much of an impact they think political violence is having on different areas of democracy in the United States. So we're not asking them how often does it happen. We're asking them how much is it affecting the health of democracy. And one thing that's been really notable is that their assessments have actually been pretty consistent for a year and a half now. That the average level of concern comes out around a 2.5 on a scale of 5, which is meaningless on its own. But what that means, based on the questions we're asking them, is essentially that the impact that we're seeing political violence, harassment, threats, the impact that we're seeing it have on democracy in the United States is not normal. This is not normal for a well-functioning democracy. And that it is raising, for many of them, they see it as raising the risk of greater democratic breakdown in the future. But they do not see that breakdown from political violence as being imminent. Which I think is a really, really important piece of this picture, because what that means is that we have time, not a ton of time, but we have time to turn this ship around, to not go down that path. And I think that is really, really important for people to understand, that the risk is real, that people should be, attentive to this issue. Also, but that this is the time to act, to counter the role that violence, threats, harassment are playing in our democracy.
Fascinating. So I'll ask the hard question, I guess. This is so Bill and I mean, we wrestle with this idea as well. So you've talked about, we have time to turn this around. You talked about, once norms are broken, they're not easily rebuilt. And it feels like, it's easy to feel kind of helpless or hopeless in this. And so you've written this about the media, but again, Bill and I haven't come up with necessarily great answers to this as well. But what's the the average American? Like, what do you do? Like, what do we do to strengthen some of these norms, or are we powerless? How do you fit into this bigger picture, I guess?
Yeah, we absolutely are not powerless. I think that is so important to emphasize in conversations like these. First, because again, when we look globally, there are countries that have turned this process around, right, that have stopped it in its tracks. So we know that. We also know that there are a ton of things that people can do in their families, in their local communities to contribute to a re-strengthening of our democracy. And if I can sort of put a plug, if you go to our website at protectdemocracy.org, there's an entire list of things that people can do within their communities, within their towns, their cities, their families, their friends, that can help contribute towards really reinvigorating our democracy in a way that we would be having a very, very different conversation in a few years, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Maybe we can wrap up with one final question about the role of the media and the challenge of covering Trump is just so complex. It's so hard. I think the media often does a really good job of trying to do that. And we've seen a bunch of different approaches. How do you assess how well the media has done? What do they do well? What do they need to be better about as we're entering Trump 2.0? What sort of advice would you give to those listening who are thinking about how the media can be better?
Yeah, I think I have to start by saying that a lot of media have actually done tremendous work in offering this kind of context and the type of context I discussed before. And I think that continuing to do that, continuing to offer that kind of context is just really vital. Outlets with the resources to do it have gone as far as setting up dedicated democracy desks, right, which focus exclusively on these kinds of issues. And that's been great. The two areas where I would say, there are bigger concerns and people should be attentive to is first the ecosystem of local media. Local and regional media is just so tough right now. And local and regional papers and news outlets, they don't have those kinds of resources. There's so much pressure on them right now, and they can't invest in having reporters exclusively on a democracy beat, right? It's a real shame. But, to that, one of the things we hoped for with the Playbook report is that it would be a resource for exactly those journalists who don't necessarily have the full support system for this kind of analysis. And the second thing that I think we need to keep an eye on is the risk of what scholars and others have called anticipatory obedience. So that we've seen some outlets signal that they're willing to pull critical pieces or try to avoid any kind of controversy, to try to avoid running afoul of those in power. And internationally, we see that, right? That is part of this process too. It's part of quashing dissent, right? It's easier to quash dissent if the threat itself is enough. And that kind of self-censorship is understandable, but it's also very bad for democracy.
This has been absolutely fantastic. That word anticipatory obedience. I'm gonna think more about that after the interview. So thank you so much, Jennifer. As a reminder, we've been talking to Dr. Jennifer Dresden from Protect Democracy.
Hey, where's Hal Sparks? I'm not sure where he is now, but I know where you can find him Saturdays at 11. He'll be right here on WCPT 820 for the Hal Sparks radio program, Mega Worldwide. You're listening to WCPT 820 because facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to WCPT. We are so excited to chat with our next guest, Roland Paris. Roland is a professor of international affairs and the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa, an associate fellow at Chatham House, and a former senior advisor on foreign policy to the outgoing Prime Minister of Canada, Justin Trudeau. On a more personal note, Roland was a thesis advisor for Phil and I years ago when we were doing our doctoral work at the University of Colorado. We should point out many, many, many years ago. Welcome, Roland. It's so nice to have a chance to talk with you. We really appreciate you joining us.
Thank you, Bill. It's terrific to be with you.
So maybe we should start with the stupid questions, and then we'll get those out of the way. Donald Trump, the president of the United States, has developed this, what we call a juvenile affinity for suggesting that Canada should simply join the United States as the 51st state, and also for referring to the Canadian Prime Minister as governor. Can you talk to us about the reactions this has caused in Canada, both maybe your own reactions as well as those in the government and public more broadly?
Well, it's bizarre to start with, and I think that the Canadian public initially was puzzled by the fact that Trump started talking about Trudeau as a governor and Canada as the 51st state. At the official level, what you saw were Canadian leaders basically trying to congratulate Trump on such an amusing joke and reassuring people here that this was a joke. But when Trump continued to repeat it, and it was clear that he was not joking, then attitude shifted. And I think that what's transparent is that this is an attempt to intimidate. It's insulting. It is strangely amusing and alarming at the same time, because this is all coming along with his threat to impose a 25% tariff on imports from Canada, which would be absolutely devastating for the Canadian economy, because 76% of our exports go to the United States, because the supply chains are absolutely integrated crisscrossing the border, and it's a huge percentage of our GDP. So I think that the concern right now is that he might actually carry out these threats, although he's said a lot of things in the past that he didn't actually do, and maybe that's the faint hope clause here.
Yeah. Hi, Roland. It's good to hear from you.
Hi, Phil.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that maybe I'll just ask you this before I'll sort of expand it a little bit. Like, what do you have, as a political scientist or even as a, former advisor, like what's your explanation for why Trump is doing this? Is it just, again, silliness? Is it ego? Like, what's his motivation here?
Yeah, it's really hard to get inside his head. But for one thing, there's a general point, which is that he does try to throw his negotiating partners off balance. This is what he's always done from back when he was a real estate mogul, and that's what he's doing here. He's doing it with Denmark. Over Greenland. He's doing it when he gave a speech yesterday virtually at the World Economic Forum, saying that all NATO countries have to spend 5% of their equivalent of GDP on defense. The United States currently spends 3.38%. Like this is like heroically, wildly ambitious. So, there's part of this is that he sets out these kind of wild starting points for discussions. But I think there's something deeper here. And the deeper thing is his connection in the State of the Union address. You heard him give a big shout out to William McKinley. And there is an expansionist quality to Trump's thinking that's coming through when he talks about Greenland, when he talks about Panama, when he talks about Canada, when he talks about the United States expanding. And, this is what is really striking to me as a political scientist, is hearing a kind of logic of manifest destiny and American expansionism that we haven't heard in a very long time, none of our lifetimes.
Yeah, so let me ask a follow-up on that, because I was thinking about this a lot this week, because you're the person who taught me about norms, right? Like, I learned about this from you. And that stuff that Trump is saying is, I think for an American audience, it's easy just to chalk it up as, this is stupid. But they're also really serious. And the thing that I thought about a lot was about how Trump's rhetoric is really kind of shaping global attitudes. And I think of, China and Russia, and how this, talk of, if we want, or if it's important to the United States, we can take Greenland, or it feels like a gift to those other countries. Can you talk a little bit about that, or how you perceive that, or what's the impact the way he's talking about has on the broader global community?
It's a great question. First, let me just say something about whether this is serious, and then let me answer your question directly about the reverberations more broadly. Yeah, this is serious. Trump's comments on Canada are already having a measurable effect on our economy. It is chilling investment already. And the Canadian government has prepared and is prepared to launch a very significant counter-retaliatory tariffs on American imports into Canada if Trump goes ahead with his tariff threat. Now, the United States is so much bigger than Canada, that nobody wants to be in a tariff fight with the United States. But I think what many Americans don't recognize is that Canada's a bigger customer for American exports than China, Japan, Britain, and France combined, that the United States gets more than 50% of the oil that it imports from Canada, natural gas, electricity, critical minerals, for high tech. And, this could be very costly on both sides of the border, and I hope that cooler heads prevail. Mm-hmm. It's serious. So in terms of the larger implications here, coming back to this idea of the United States, of Trump's vision of the United States effectively having a kind of free hand to demand that weaker countries within its immediate surroundings comply with his wishes, even hand over territory in the case of Greenland. This is very consistent with a kind of spheres of influence logic of rights and obligations in international affairs. Now, the dominant logic in international affairs, the dominant norm is that of sovereignty, which is territorial integrity and political independence. And that's why it was so shocking to us to see Vladimir Putin, wantonly and brazenly invade a neighboring country and claim that he had a right to invade that country, that it wasn't really a country if you think about it. And it's shocking to us to see what China has been doing in the South and East China Sea, claiming all of this space as China's own and basically saying, try us. We dare you. Well, this logic that Trump is describing, or at least communicating with regard to Canada and Panama and Greenland, is really consistent with that kind of spheres of influence logic. And it, I think, creates a very easy opportunity for emboldened authoritarians elsewhere basically to say, listen, the United States, leader of the free world. Now I would put that in quotation marks, by the way.
Right.
The United States itself is demonstrating that these norms have changed.
Oh, that's significant. Yeah. Roland, we chatted with you during the Trump's first term about how the international community can and should respond to American leadership or the lack thereof under Trump. A lot has changed since then, both in the United States and internationally. But we were curious to hear what your thoughts are now on how you think the international community should respond to American leadership, this new approach.
Well, the strategies in Trump 1 might not work in Trump 2, but in Trump 1, the most successful strategies involved a couple of things. One was really expanding contacts and networks with American influencers, if I can use that term, at all levels of the U.S. political system, in Washington, at the state level, at the local level, in industry, in labor, and mobilizing those networks around very specific issues that were important to Canada or important to other countries that were engaging with the first Trump administration. And the second part involved a kind of jujitsu where there was an attempt not to directly confront Trump, but to basically say, yeah, okay, we hear what you're saying, but let's talk about it. Let's figure something out. Perfect example was the renegotiation of the NAFTA and its transformation into what's called the USMCA in the United States. And essentially what happened was all of those two strategies were put into effect, and we ended up with something that was very similar to the original NAFTA, where really important core interests of Canada were preserved. But Trump, in the end, was able to say that this was the NAFTA had been the worst trade deal in the history of the earth, and the USMCA was his baby. It was the best. Now, that was the strategy the first time around. Trump, I'm expecting, we're already seeing, is much more unleashed this time. He knows this is his last time in office. He's learned the levers of power. He's gotten rid of people. He's not appointing people who might resist him. He's getting rid of people in the bureaucracy who could be potential obstacles. He's already stacked the Supreme Court, which, in spite of all the attempts to hold Trump to account for his various actions, actually resulted in a decision which immunizes Trump from most possible prosecution, and he controls both houses. Have to be ready to push back very hard, and I think that's what the European Union is going to be ready to do too.
Thank you. Sorry about that. We went to break just a little bit too early. That was my mistake. So we are talking with Roland Paris. We're going to take a quick break now, and then we will be right back in just a second.
Alexa, play WCPT.
WCPT from TuneIn.
Joan Esposito. Live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to WCPT. We are chatting with Dr. Roland Paris from the University of Ottawa, and we've been thinking about the role of the Trump administration, both in Canada, internationally. Phil, you were going to ask another question here.
Well, just as a follow-up, you have served as an advisor to the Prime Minister. So just to make it sort of concrete, like if you were advising the Prime Minister today, how do you advise him? Like, what are the concrete things you recommend in responding to someone like Trump, a bully in the international system?
Yeah, well, there are a few things, and the government is essentially already doing these things. First of all, Trump initially indicated to Justin Trudeau when they met at Mar-a-Lago that he was really concerned about the flow of people over the Canadian border in the United States and the flow of drugs, in particular fentanyl. So the Canadian government came back and within the space of a couple of weeks announced a major new program to expand border security and also to deal with the fentanyl traffic. Now, I should say that it is tiny by comparison with the equivalent of the U.S. southern border. But the idea here was, first and foremost, okay, he has a concern about border security. It doesn't hurt us to strengthen border security. It helps us. We care about fentanyl, too. We'll do more on that. That's number one. Number two, redoubling efforts to make contact with people who are in the incoming elements of the new administration, people who have the ear of people who are coming into the new administration, and partners right across the U.S. political system. So this is a vital network to be able to activate when stuff happens and to avoid problems from occurring. Thirdly, preparing for all different scenarios, and that's what the Canadian government has been doing, including the possibility of the 25% tariff on Canadian imports in the United States, which, viewed from this side of the Canada-U.S. border, is a nuclear decision by Donald Trump. So there's a kind of mix and match combination of strategies that are available, and the Canadian government will almost certainly match dollar for dollar any tariffs, and will have in its back pocket more serious things that it could do. But of course, everybody here is aware that getting into a knife fight with Donald Trump when the U.S. economy is 10 times as big as the Canadian economy probably isn't going to be successful in the long run.
Mm-hmm. Roland, Canada is set to have elections in the coming months, and Prime Minister Trudeau, who you worked with closely, recently announced his decision to step down as the leader of the Liberal Party. Can you talk a bit about what led to such a significant shift in support for Trudeau over the past couple of years?
So, Justin Trudeau is now, it's pretty close to 10 years that he's been in office. It's certainly, he's in his 10th year. And about 18 months ago or so, the public opinion polls really decisively shifted against him. And why? A whole bunch of reasons, but the most important one is time. So governments tend to last up to about 10 years in this country. There is, in democracies, the very welcome practice of throw the bums out. It's the escape valve that democracy always has, and people were very clearly tired of him. But he was also, suffered from the same challenges that many incumbents did who were in power during the pandemic. All of the disruptions and all of the irritations and all of the frustrations and all of the social ills, including the subsequent inflation and cost of living challenges and housing problems, et cetera, they all quite appropriately fell on his doorstep, and he just couldn't survive that.
So despite all of that, I mean, so it looks like, who knows? We're not predicting the future, but the Conservative Party leader, Pierre Poilievre, am I pronouncing that properly?
Yeah, that's right.
Appears to be, he's likely to be the next prime minister. And people have accused him of being a soft populist. But I guess one of my things that I think about as a sort of comparativist who I look out at things is, despite all that stuff that you just mentioned, inflation and all these other things, Canada seems to, have had a healthier immune system in their resistance to what has happened much, in many places around the world, which is the rise of populism and whatnot. Like, when you look at it, what do you think? What has made the difference between the American, tendency to succumb to this populist rhetoric versus Canada's ability to kind of withstand it?
Yeah. So, one thing that's important to note here is that, and I think that it's visible around the world, is when we're talking about the impact of Trump's behavior on international norms, it's not just the norms of how countries interact with each other. It's also kind of norms and habits and practices and customs about how politicians behave. And this kind of contagion effect that's described in the political science literature is very much visible in terms of Trump's style of leadership, and we see that being replicated everywhere. Now, Pierre Poilievre is no Donald Trump. Right. And even though Pierre Poilievre, the leader of the opposition Conservative Party, who's 24 points ahead in the polls right now and who would win if there were an election today, even though he's picked up the kind of language of the culture wars from the United States. He sat down recently, interviewed with the now Canadian expat Jordan Peterson, and railed about wokeism and the usual assortment of things. He is constrained in a way by the political structures of Canada. There's a political culture dimension to this, but there's also an institutional effect. The political culture and political cultures can break down, and we're seeing that happen to some extent in Canada. The political culture is the expectation of how politicians are supposed to behave, and that expectation is embedded, and it's mainly embedded in the minds of voters. And anyone who was behaving as rudely as Trump is behaving would very much still violate essential political norms in this country that are embedded in the minds of voters. But those norms are being eroded by just seeing this happen right across the border. But I think that, Pierre Poilievre will see the institutional dimensions are that in order to govern this country, you really do effectively have to maintain a coalition. And there are elements in the Canadian public, regionally concentrated, that are more Trumpy than others, but you really can't govern in this country without very strong support from the areas around either in Ontario, around Toronto, or in Quebec. And they tend to be more moderate voters. So if they have to be part of a winning coalition, a governing coalition, then that also has a moderating effect.
We would love to get your take on what you see as you look out at the international system right now. I mean, there's some conversation that we may be...
I can't say that on the radio, I don't think.
The edited version, maybe. Because, some people talk about that we may be entering the most dangerous international moment since the end of the Cold War, war in Ukraine, conflict in the Middle East, rising tensions between the United States and China. How do you assess this, or what do you see when you look out at the world? And, fewer profanities is probably the better.
Yeah, I'll try to maintain the norms of our own conversation.
Yes.
And I'm happy to do so. Listen, the world is clearly becoming more dangerous. Everyone of a certain age has lived through a period of extraordinary stability in international affairs. And I'm talking about the period right after the end of the Cold War. And we look back on those days and maybe kind of smile at how naive people felt or were expressing themselves, or we ourselves felt about the direction of the world. But we're not in Kansas anymore. That is definitely changed. And so part of the challenge here is, relative to what? The world is dangerous now relative to what? It is certainly more dangerous than it was, a decade ago or 2 decades ago. What is the prospect of major power war right now? I'm talking about United States, Russia, China. growing, but not imminent. But we're living through, I think, to pick up some of the political science literature too, we're living through a period of power transition, and the power transition is from a period of American unipolar dominance to something else. Some people call it multipolar. Some people think it would basically be defined by a kind of U.S.-China arrangement. Other people see much more complicated arrangements. Whatever it is, we're living through this power transition, and we know from previous power transitions that they tend to be the most unstable times and the highest likelihood of war, and that navigating those periods requires a considerable amount of maturity from the leaders of the most powerful countries in order to keep guardrails in place and to minimize the risk of escalation, and to recognize that all of these countries have some portion of responsibility to sustain, the relative stability of the system as a whole. Even during the Cold War, the United States and the Soviet Union really practiced a sense of. It's hard to imagine and it's hard to identify, but there was an element of responsibility there in terms of the guardrails that they established, avoiding direct contact between their forces and many other norms that were established. I don't see that kind of maturity in the leaders today. And so you put the power transition together with this recklessness. I see growing recklessness. That's what gets me really worried. It's the recklessness combined with the, underlying shifts that would be a challenge to manage under any circumstances.
Phil, you got one more question here?
Well, I mean, I have it's a big question, so I don't know if we have time I don't know how much time we have.
Sure, we got some time, yeah.
So, I mean, I tend to, I think Bill would agree, and I feel pretty confident you do, that like the international order, the international systems, they've been pretty good to us. So, as they are under challenge and as we don't have particularly mature leadership, what for those of us who want to see, an expansion instead of a collapse of things like international law and human rights and all of these things, how does the international community do that? Are we just at the mercy of the Donald Trumps of the world?
I was having a conversation with my wife last night, somewhat dark, and we try and keep each other buoyed up. In her work, she deals with things that can be sometimes a little bit dark. In my work, in our work, we also deal with these challenges. And, I used to say, honey, things could be worse. Donald Trump could still be the president of the United States. So I've now replaced that. I think I said last night, sweetheart, just look on the bright side. This reckless, hostile, dangerous person, president of the United States, has 3 years and 362 days left in his term.
I think that's a perfect place to wrap up, Roland. So we are so thankful for your time and insight. As a reminder to the audience, we've been talking with Roland Paris, who is a professor of international affairs and the director of the Graduate School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Ottawa. Thank you so much, Roland. We've really appreciated it. It's so great to catch up.
It's terrific talking to both of you guys, too. Thank you for having me.
That sounds great. All right, we will be taking a quick break, and we'll be right back in just a minute.
This is Chicago's Progressive Talk, 820 AM, WCPT Willow Springs, and online at WCPT820.com, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. That was a really great conversation with Roland. We'll break that down in just a second now. But just to remind everybody, if you're looking to purchase a new home or refinance your existing home, you need to call Team Hochberg, your trusted local lender with over 500 five-star Google reviews. Kathy, 60, a nurse who lives in a $600,000 home, called Team Hochberg for a free consultation to consolidate the over $30,000 she accumulated on her credit card after her husband passed away. After speaking with David, Kathy Kathy posted this 5-star Google review. Quote, David was very helpful. He didn't try to sell me anything. He advised me to keep my current mortgage because of my low rate. He offered me excellent advice and was very patient, kind, and knowledgeable. I highly recommend his service to anyone looking for a mortgage or any financial expertise, unquote. If you'd like this type of 5-star service at your next mortgage, on your next mortgage, do what she did and call Team Hochberg at 855-563-2843 or visit 56david.com. David's helped thousands of WCT listeners, but he can't help you if you don't call 855-563-2843 or 56david.com. This is an equal housing lender, NMLS 1124061. All right, Phil, that conversation with Roland really gets me thinking about the moment the United States finds itself in the Donald Trump presidency, Canada, like so many things were coming together. What struck you about that conversation?
Well, I mean, it's always fun talking to Roland. He's just, I don't know, feels he's one of the smartest people I know, and just getting to hear his view on things is always enjoyable. But yeah, I mean, I think about, international norms and I think talking to him just brings that forward in my head again. Like, we are at a place, I think that's the part about, like, again, the attacks on Canada, and it's so easy to chalk those up as like Donald Trump's silliness, right? But they alter how the international community, how other countries think and behave. Norms there's this tendency to feel like norms evolve in this positive way. Like the history of the world is like growing in these more positive, more, focus on human rights, all these other things. But norms can evolve. They can also devolve, right? They can move in the opposite direction. And I think you and I, we talked, in the first Trump administration about how dangerous his rhetoric is, even if the actions don't follow, just the way he talks. And that's where I think about, again, it's talking about using military and economic force, and Roland touched on that as well. It is absolutely buying into and solidifying, helping build up this, it's what Russia and China have been talking about for years. They want a different interpretation of sovereignty and about how they use power. And it feels like this is just playing right into that playbook. And it might be silly in Donald Trump. I don't think it's silly. I think it's all personal in Donald Trump's head. But, whatever it is, the implications of this moment are so significant for not just for the next 4 years, for the next 50 years.
Well, and I think to your point about, the idea that a lot of this is silly and stupid, and it is, right? It's juvenile, but Roland's point to say that this is also very, very serious. Yeah. And he noted, like, it's very serious for Canada, right? The United States and Canada have these intense networks of economic exchange, and those are really important. But it's not just important for Canada; it's also important for the United States, right? Yep. This is essential to our economy, and if we're worried about the price of eggs, the idea of causing an economic war with one of your closest partners is really a bad idea. It's bad for eggs, Phil, right? I mean, so all of these things. No, I think the gravity and seriousness that Roland reinforced was really, really valuable.
Well, and it's a dated view that is driving this as well, a dated sort of self-concept. So there's this tendency for these leaders to think about, or Donald Trump talks about American power like it's still 1950, right? And that is not the situation that we find ourselves in this way. As Roland talked about, right? We're entering this new world, which maybe it's multipolar, maybe it's whatever, but the United States doesn't, like, you can't just like throw your weight around and get your way like you used to. We need our allies, especially to sort of achieve our goals. And it feels like this kind of isolationist bullying drive comes along at just the wrong time.
Well, you talked, it's like a throwback to like the 19th century, right? I mean, Roland also mentioned William McKinley, right? Which is, I think that's a really, really important point because it references the sort of imperialist impulse that Donald Trump has. So like most of us don't spend a lot of time thinking about William McKinley, the president, right, of the United States. But it's really important because Trump clearly likes him. One reason is McKinley liked tariffs, right? So, obviously, if McKinley likes tariffs, Trump likes tariffs. But also the sort of expansionist dynamic. So McKinley, let's see, I'm trying to remember if it was the Philippines and Puerto Rico and Guam. I mean, the United States literally took over territory during those times. And during Trump's inaugural address, he made multiple references to McKinley, describing McKinley as someone who made our country very rich through tariffs, through talent. But he also Trump used that idea that we need to expand our territory. Trump said the United States will once again consider itself a growing nation. one that increases our wealth, expands our territory, right? That's something we haven't heard out of a Democrat or Republican president in 100 years, right? The idea, right? I mean, it's the idea that we are going to expand territory. So many of us thought as we entered the world of globalization, power is no longer tied to physical territory. Yep. It's economic power. And so all of this is norm shattering, regime changing. It's a new era of international and domestic politics.
I mean, to talk about, he used the term manifest destiny in his speech. Like it is again, this notion that is very 19th century in and of itself. But I don't really know, especially in the world today where we like international law, the idea of conquest or whatever is illegal and has been for a significant period of time. So unless you really are coming up with some sort of amazing negotiation to buy territory, it's not allowed. It's not acceptable. It's not like there's just no need in a globalized world with as much trade to even think that way. Like it just feels
you're perplexed.
I am.
It's not productive, right? The United States can be and has been the dominant global economic and political force without adding territory, right? I mean, you could talk about, oftentimes, they talk about this idea of imperialism and that America, even if we think about ourselves as an empire, we're a different type of empire because we don't take territory. Yep. And we don't need to because we develop these extensive economic ties. Now, we could have a real serious conversation about whether that's always good for the world, good for the United States. Right. But the idea of reverting back to this moment when taking territories, taking Greenland, Canada, the Panama Canal, it's so juvenile. And maybe that's it. Maybe it's just a way of distracting and negotiating tactic, but the norms and the rhetoric matter. Upsetting a relationship with Canada, even if nothing ultimately develops out of this, matters. It's bad foreign policy.
Yeah, well, and it fits in with. It's that kind of 19th century worldview. Yeah. Like it's straight. There's an oddity to like wanting to expand territory at the same time that you're talking about becoming more exclusionary at home. Like we don't want other people coming here, but we do want to take the land that the other people have. I mean, that is very like that. We're not talking about like going back to the 1980s in politics. We're talking about going back to the 1880s in politics.
And there was a good reason for leaving that era.
Yes.
The other interesting thing that Roland was really talking about is how the rest of the world is assessing America and the unique role for American leadership. America and American hegemony certainly has warts, and we have not always been perfect. Yep. But there still is a role for the United States to lead the world. And if the United States doesn't take that opportunity, others are going to, most notably China, right? So if we're thinking about things like global marketplaces, human rights, international norms and laws and human rights, and all of that is dependent upon the United States continuing to preserve those systems. And Donald Trump just wants to run away from those systems. Yeah. And there are costs to the United States for doing so. It's not just like that, we're forcing NATO to pay all that. No, right? These are real costs to Americans and, livelihoods. All of those things will suffer because of these choices.
Yeah, well, and I kind of feel like maybe we've crossed the line at this point. Yeah. You and I talked during the first Trump administration about how it would take such a long time for American leadership to recover, right? Yeah. So, Donald Trump, attacks NATO allies, does all of this other stuff. And we had talked about, like, even when Biden was reelected, there's still going to be the sort of residue of those Trump years in which allies are going to feel like, how much can I actually trust Joe Biden? When you've done this twice, like we know what a Trump administration looks like. We know it is clear what he offers domestically, but also internationally. And we as a country have said, yep, that's what we want. Yeah. I don't know that there's any repairing. Like, I don't know that American leadership can ever really be, I mean, I shouldn't say ever, but we're not talking like, we're talking decades, right? Centuries before American leadership can sort of play that sort of role again. Doesn't mean we shouldn't try.
Right.
But I think, the idea that others are going to sort of follow America's lead, there's going to be hesitation for a long time. Skepticism. Yeah, you can't recover that.
No. After the first Trump administration, Europe was like, and Joe Biden was elected, Europe was like, Okay. We'll give you that one.
Yeah.
But if you do it again, America, this is now on you, right? There's been some really fascinating writing lately talking about that. There are a lot of Americans, us included, who sort of see this as an aberration, that Trump really isn't who America is. But the rest of the world looks at this and says, no, America, like right now, this is not an accident. You made this choice, right? So the rest of the world will say, we need to move on without assuming that American leadership isn't going to be there. You see this in Europe already, where they're starting to say, we have to try to solve our own problems. We need to move forward without the United States. And again, that is not in the United States' interest, and it will make things more complicated, whether we're talking about balancing China, creating global networks for American companies to sell their goods. Like, all of those things are dependent upon American leadership and the world saying we want to have that relationship.
Yeah. I think about the other part. I think about there was a sort of a commonality with Jennifer Dresden's interview as well, in that there's this talk of, she talked about like throwing the baby out with the bathwater, right?
Yeah.
And I think about there's this tendency with American democracy, and it's the same thing with international institutions, right? There's this willingness of people to get frustrated with them because they haven't been perfect, they haven't delivered on all their promises, but it is so short-sighted to basically say, and so we're going to do away with democracy, or we're going to do away with all of these international institutions. Like this failure to recognize that not all, but a massive amount of the success that America has been able to achieve internationally and domestically is related to these admittedly flawed systems.
Sure.
But the push should be to improve those, not to abandon them, right? And that's hard to watch.
To have serious conversations about what the United States could do better and where we've fallen short, and trying to improve those, right? Real policy conversations. As you were talking, I found myself thinking about immigration. Yeah. And central to U.S. economic success is immigration, right? You're bringing people in, and certainly you could come up with better systems for managing that process. But when Donald Trump just says, we're cutting ourselves off from the world, and we no longer want immigrants, and all of that will also have a negative impact on the U.S. economy. These are real things with real costs, and it feels like we've got a toddler running. Dan Dresner, who's another political science, used to have this thread, like it was toddler in chief, and he talked about all these juvenile things that Donald Trump does, and it feels like we're back in that moment again when we can't have serious conversations. Everything is dumbed down.
Yeah, it's it's back to, again, this notion some of the callers earlier we talked about, like the serious conversations about policy and solutions versus like I feel grumpy about that. I'm mad about this, right? And it feels like this is some level of I don't know. Again, it's a sort of a simplistic response to a complex problem,
and it does feel like the world is quickly adapting to these new norms that the Trump has established, both internationally and domestically. Oh, yeah, you had a thought?
Well, I mean, you had talked earlier about, if American doesn't fill this sort of leadership position, China gladly will. And I think that's the hard part to recognize. There's a lot of countries that aren't thrilled with Chinese leadership. They would prefer American leadership. But stability, right? Consistency, knowing what to expect is preferable to the sort of roller coaster ride that we've been on with American leadership. And you see that a little bit, already in how some other countries are kind of reacting to the new Trump administration.
Well, Jennifer Dresden talked about Humpty Dumpty, right? That when you break some of these things, you can't just put them back together. And that's what we're seeing. I mean, again, I'm also thinking about the role of the tech oligarchy, right? So we think about Donald Trump's inauguration. There you had Google and Facebook and Meta and all of them, Amazon, they're all sitting there. And that's important as well, right? That suggests, as we think about the way in which Trump is going to change all of these norms and dynamics, they're on board, right? They realize, right? And some of it may be self-interested. Some of them, maybe Zuckerberg buys into the philosophy, whatever that might be. But we are shifting in a very different direction. Well, we probably need to take one more break, but when we come back, Phil, we're going to talk about how we confront this. Like, how do we move forward?
10 minutes will be enough to solve that, right?
Absolutely. We'll be very concise. So we'll be right back on WCPT.
Chicago's Progressive Talk, WCPT 820, where facts matter.
Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive. Filling in today for Joan, political science professor at North Central College, author and podcaster, William Muck.
Because that's how we roll. Welcome back to the Joan Esposito Show. We're going to offer our final little segment here, some thoughts about how we move forward, how do we respond to a second Trump administration. Before we do so, I just want to, I hope everybody knows that Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive, now has its very own podcast, two actually. Joan Esposito full episodes and Joan Esposito featured interviews. You can subscribe to one or both. The podcast is available on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, YouTube, and Amazon. Just search for Joan Esposito, or get the links on Joan's show page by visiting heartlandsignal.com and clicking on her picture. Right now on the featured interview podcast, you can find Joan's recent conversations with Professors John Shaw, Allison Dangas, Richard Cobb, Catherine Ross, her post-inauguration chat with Jill Wine-Banks, Capital Foods writer Mark Eaton, and much, much more. So make sure to check that out. Joan Esposito, live, local, and progressive in a variety of podcast forms. So, all right, Phil, this is sort of the million-dollar question about how you move forward. And there have been a number of interesting articles written about this. And, this question of whether do you resist or do you coexist with Donald Trump? And the New York Times had a pretty fascinating editorial on this. And they talked about Donald Trump uses fear. He builds off fear, and he uses it to intimidate political figures, the media. He uses it to go after, politicians, academics, right? He's going after all across the board. And he uses this as a form of intimidation to get people to stop pushing back. Yep. What do you think about how we respond to this environment of fear and intimidation?
Well, I mean, I think that's the whole point, right? Yeah. They're trying to intimidate us into not responding and not pushing back. So, the conversation with Roland and with Jennifer both, this theme of norms came up over and over again, and I think it's important to remember that all norms are we create norms, right? All norms are how we talk about the standards we hold people to, right? And so, the idea of we also talked about this sort of massive shock and awe sort of first week of the campaign. And it's designed to create fear, also to sort of overwhelm, to create, I think about, I talk with my students a lot about how it's 100% understandable why people would be disheartened and cynical, right? Cynical about the American political system. You should be, right? Based on how we've gone through things. But at the same time, cynicism is so destructive. It's okay to feel frustrated, but in the end, you have to push back. That's how you reestablish norms. That's how you hold people accountable. And so, it's not. None of that's easy, right? No. I don't know exactly how you do that, but it's okay to be disheartened and cynical, but it's not okay to let that lead you into
inaction, apathy, all of that. This New York Times piece talked about, and I thought it was really precise in terms of understanding the threat posed by Trump. And they write, Trump's goals in these efforts of fear and intimidation have been to push people to check themselves rather than check his power. Now, as he reappears to re-enter the Oval Office, Mr. Trump is using fear not only with Congress, but also with other essential independent institutions such as courts, business, higher education, and the news media. The goal is broadly the same: to deter elected officials, judges, executives, and others from exercising their duties in a way that challenge him or hold him accountable. He wants to make dissent so painful as to be intolerable. And I read that and I thought, this is exactly what's happening, right? He wants to raise the bar so nobody pushes back. And what we've seen out a lot of people, including the tech industry, is coexist, right? Bezos is saying, Melania, here's $40 million for your movie. Zuckerberg, and Elon Musk, we don't even need to talk about Elon. There's so many, CEO of Google, all of them are there bending the knee as a way of saying it's in our economic interest to cooperate with this. But that's not what you need if you want to really have the institutions of democracy and civil society more broadly pull the democracy back in a different direction, a better direction.
Well, all of this, and that's what it's illustrated with the tech stuff. It's illustrated with the Republican Party. It's illustrated with, average citizens. It's all of this sort of collective action problem, right? And this is how Donald Trump is so effective, is that when one person speaks out, they get attacked. And so if everyone acts together, if everyone speaks together, that's the way to do this. But it's hard to, that's where Trump's approach approach is really effective.
Divide and conquer.
Yeah, you and I talked this morning. I think, like, how do you respond, and what does it mean to push back against the fear or the willingness? And you and I talked about the minister, the bishop.
Yes.
What was her name?
Let's see. The Episcopal Bishop of Washington, Marian Edgar Booty. Yes. Oh, what a great example.
Perfect example of how to respond in this, right? Calling out Trump. But
in a church service.
In a church service.
He can't run away.
Just speaking truth, right? And doing so in a way that is like 100% defensible. I'm asking you to show mercy and kindness, right? That's not even an attack on Trump. The fact that people have interpreted it as an attack on Trump is so telling, right? Like
there were a number of Republican members of Congress who wanted her deported, right? I mean, which just sort of fits this broader narrative, right? Any sort of pushback, we're going to throw you in with the other, right? And the other is the people that we're going to deport, the not real Americans, right? I thought that was stunning. No, this is such a great example of somebody who used her platform in a challenging way, right? I mean, she's facing lots of criticism from MAGA world, but also directly from Donald Trump. She put herself in harm's way, but that's the kind of response that's necessary if you're going to push back and not let all of these practices and norms and institutions and democracy itself be steamrolled by Trump, who is way more effective, way more organized, has loyal following, implementing his initiatives,
and has an understanding of human nature. I think in this, in that he understands that it's scary, it's difficult for one person to speak up, but it's sad that this minister this bishop is the one, in contrast to, again, Republican leaders, or as we talked about earlier in the show, George Bush, right? Like, people who have every ability and power. It shouldn't fall to the everyday people to speak up, but every day. I mean, this is how it was. This is looking back at the first Trump administration. This is what upheld the norms, right? When the attacks on elections and all that other stuff came along, it wasn't the big wig, leaders in the Republican Party. It was the local officials who were willing to stand up and say, "Yep, I'm not doing that. This is, I swore an oath to uphold the election." That's what it depends on. It depends on the everyday people holding themselves and others accountable for these actions.
And I think the reality is much more of this will fall on the Republican Party, because to your point, they are the ones that can make the difference. Democrats can criticize them and talk about norms and institutions, all of that, and that's important, right? The narrative needs to be out there, but it really, when it comes from Republican or conservative voices, somebody like George W. Bush, that's more important. Or from the tech oligarchy, like those individuals, corporations also have a role, local officials have a role. I go back to this New York Times piece, because this one really hit me hard. They closed the piece by saying, if institutions surrender to the fear and coercion by bending the knee or rationalizing that the next right actions aren't worth the fight, stress, or risk, they not only embolden future abuses, they are also complicit in understanding their own power and influence, right? I find that's so spot on. So as we think about again, we're not even a week in, Phil, but I think it's important to start thinking about and articulating the response. And I think coexist isn't. It has to really be thinking about, especially in the moments when Trump is violating norms, undermining democratic practices, it has to be resist and sort of meaningful resist.
Well, and I think the idea of the institutions, right? They're talking about institutions. That's key and important, but it's easy to feel like institutions are these abstract things, and really the institutions are the people, right? It's the people who are willing to uphold those rules.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Phil, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you for flying all the way out from New Hampshire to sit down in Chicago and have some conversations on the Joan Esposito show. And again, to Joan, I hope you are having a wonderful birthday, and thank you so much for the opportunity to be here. We love raising the level of civil discourse.
Thank you for sharing the space with me today. It's been great.
Absolutely. Well, we will see you again next time on the Joan Esposito on WCPT. Stay well.